Picture a stretch of ocean so remote that most maps barely bother to name it. No beaches, no ports, no witnesses. Just iron grey water running all the way to the edge of the world, somewhere between Soviet-controlled islands and the frozen rim of Alaska, where the North Pacific becomes something else entirely. Cold, indifferent, ancient. In the winter of 1943, that water had a secret, and it would keep that secret for decades. Most people who study the Second World War, who can recite the beaches of Normandy, who know the weight of Stalingrad, who feel the heat of the Pacific Island campaigns in their bones, have never heard of what happened on the 26th of March, 1943, off a Soviet-controlled island chain called the Komandorski Islands. There were no headlines screaming across the front pages of American newspapers. There was no Hollywood film. There was no monument you can visit today and run your fingers across the names of the fallen. What happened out there happened in the dark, in every sense of the word, remote, overlooked, and deliberately downplayed by the very men who survived it. And yet, what happened in those waters was, by every measure of naval history, extraordinary. It was the last daylight surface naval battle of the entire Second World War, fought without a single aircraft on either side. It was one of the longest continuous gunnery duels in all of modern naval warfare. It was a confrontation between a small American task group, outgunned and outnumbered, and a Japanese northern force that should have destroyed them in under an hour. And when the guns finally went silent, when both sides turned away from each other across that freezing water, the outcome defied every calculation, every tactical prediction, every expectation that history and mathematics had written in advance. This is the story the war forgot, and it is time to remember it. The forgotten frontier, the Aleutian Islands, and the world nobody wanted. There is a chain of islands that curves southwest from the tip of Alaska, like the tail of something enormous disappearing beneath the waves. The Aleutian Islands, stretching for more than 1,000 miles across some of the most inhospitable ocean on Earth. They are a place that geography built, but history largely ignored. Until, in the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy decided that ignoring them was no longer an option. What happened next was a campaign so brutal in its weather, so grinding in its logistics, and so strategically peculiar in its shape, that even the men who fought it struggled to explain why it mattered, but it did matter, enormously. And to understand why 6 American ships ended up in a gunfight they were never supposed to survive, you have to begin here, on these cold, fog-wrapped rocks at the edge of the world. The Aleutian Islands are not beautiful in any conventional sense. They are volcanic, bare, and swept by winds that can change direction 4 times in an hour. Fog descends without warning and holds for days. The sea around them is almost never calm. Sailors who operated in these waters described conditions that made the Atlantic convoys seem, by comparison, forgiving. And yet the islands mattered strategically, in a way that both Tokyo and Washington understood, even if neither side had originally planned for them to become a battleground. The chain runs like a stepping stone path between the North American continents and the Japanese home islands. A geographic bridge that, in theory, could carry an invasion force in either direction. When Japan entered the war in December of 1941, American planners in Washington looked at the Aleutians and saw a vulnerability. A Japanese force established on those islands, even a modest one, would be within range of the American northwest coast. It would represent, symbolically and practically, the enemy standing on North American soil. That possibility was not something the United States government was prepared to accept. In June of 1942, the Japanese moved first, under the cover of the wider Midway operation, an attempt to draw American carrier forces into a decisive engagement further south. Japanese troops landed on two of the westernmost Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska. The Midway operation failed catastrophically for Japan, but the Aleutian occupation succeeded quietly, without fanfare and without the dramatic naval battle that had been intended to overshadow it. Two small islands, thousands of miles from anywhere, were now under Japanese control. They were the only pieces of North American soil occupied by a foreign power since the War of 1812. For the United States, the occupation was as much a political problem as a military one. The American public, already jolted by Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, was in no mood to accept enemy forces sitting on American territory, however remote. Washington responded with what resources it could spare. And in the middle of 1942, those resources were stretched almost beyond bearing. The Pacific Fleet was rebuilding after its losses. The Atlantic demanded attention. North Africa was opening a new front. The Aleutians, strategically important but geographically nightmarish, had to be managed with whatever was left over. What was left over turned out to be a collection of worn cruisers, destroyers, submarines, Army Air Forces bombers operating from primitive fields carved out of tundra, and soldiers whose training had not prepared them for the specific, body-breaking misery of Aleutian service. The cold was not like the cold of mainland winters. It was wet cold, penetrating cold, the kind that found its way through every layer of clothing and settled in the joints and refused to leave. Equipment failed at rates that maintenance manuals had never anticipated. Aircraft engines seized. Ship machinery corroded faster than it could be repaired. And through all of it, the fog, the endless, disorienting, mission-cancelling fog, through the second half of 1942 and into the opening months of 1943, both sides settled into a grinding war of attrition in the North Pacific. American forces bombed the Japanese garrisons on Attu and Kiska whenever the weather permitted, which was not often. Japanese forces dug in, fortified their positions, and waited for resupply. The resupply was the problem. Getting men and material to those islands required running convoys all the way from the Japanese home islands, or from the Kuril chain. A journey of many hundreds of miles across open, contested ocean. American submarines patrolled those waters. American cruiser forces ran intercept patrols. Every Japanese convoy that set out for Attu or Kiska was a calculated gamble. By early 1943, the situation on Attu was becoming critical. The garrison there was not well supplied. The men were eating reduced rations. Their weapons and ammunition stocks were running low. Whatever Tokyo intended for the long-term future of its Aleutian presence, the short-term reality was simple. Without a successful resupply run, the garrison on Attu would wither. And so, in the late weeks of March 1943, the Japanese Northern Force prepared a convoy. It would be heavily escorted. It would move fast. It would carry the supplies that Attu desperately needed. It would be commanded by Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, an experienced officer who had every reason to believe that the run could be made successfully. What he did not know, what no one on the Japanese side could have known, was that the Americans had read his mail. The interception of a Japanese radio message in Hawaii had given American intelligence the outline of the operation. A convoy was coming. American forces were ordered to stop it. Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, commanding a small task group operating out of the Aleutian chain, was given the order to intercept and destroy. what his small force would find when it met that convoy on the 26th of March was nothing like what the intelligence had prepared him for. The convoy was not lightly escorted. It was protected by a force that dwarfed his own, and in those icy waters south of the Komandorski Islands, a battle would begin that no one had designed, no one had planned for, and no one on the American side had any realistic expectation of winning. This is where it starts, not in a war room, not on a map table in Washington or Tokyo. It starts in the cold, in the dark before a North Pacific dawn, with radar screens, blips that were not supposed to be there, showing Grieve, Chapter 2. The men who would fight it, Charles McMorris and Boshiro Hosogaya. Every naval battle is, at its core, a story about men making decisions under conditions that no peacetime exercise could fully replicate. The guns, the ships, the weather, these are the frame. But the decisions made by the men in command determine the picture that fills that frame. At Komandorski, the two commanders could not have been more different in background, in temperament, and in the circumstances they carried into that confrontation. Understanding them is essential to understanding what happened and why it happened the way it did. Rear Admiral Charles Horatio McMorris was a man shaped by the United States Naval Academy and decades of surface warfare experience. He was known throughout the service as a thoughtful, methodical officer, someone who respected the mathematics of naval combat, but who also understood that mathematics rarely survived first contact with reality. His nickname within the fleet was Sok, a reference to the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, given by classmates who recognized in him a habit of relentless questioning, of probing every assumption before acting on it. He was not a reckless man. He was not a glory seeker. He was a professional operating at the far end of a supply chain that had never prioritized the North Pacific, commanding ships that had been at sea for months, with crews that were tired and equipment that was showing its age. McMorris's task group was built around 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. His flagship was the light cruiser USS Richmond, a ship of the Omaha class that was, by 1943 standards, showing its age. His principal striking force was the heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City, a Pensacola-class ship that the men who sailed her called, with rough affection, the swayback Maru. The nickname was not a compliment to her lines, which were long, slightly awkward, and earned comparisons to an old horse that had been ridden too hard for too many years. But what the Salt Lake City lacked in elegance, she made up for in capability. Her 8-inch guns were powerful, her crew was experienced, and she had a reputation for absorbing punishment with something resembling stubbornness. She would need every ounce of that reputation before the day was over. The 4 destroyers that completed McMorris's task group were the USS Coghlan, USS Bailey, USS Dale, and USS Monaghan. In the hierarchy of naval combat, destroyers were the workhorses, fast, relatively fragile, carrying torpedoes and light guns, intended for screening, harassing, and attacking at close range. Against heavy cruisers at distance, their guns were largely ineffective. Their torpedoes, however, were another matter entirely. And on this particular morning, far from any support, in waters where there would be no air cover and no reinforcement, those 4 destroyers would be asked to do things that their designers had never written into any tactical manual. Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, commanding the Japanese Northern Force from the heavy cruiser Nachi, was a man in a difficult position, though on the morning of the 26th of March, that difficulty was not yet visible. He commanded a force that was, by any objective measure, substantially superior to whatever American task group might be operating in these waters. His force included the heavy cruisers Nachi and Maya, powerful, modern ships, each carrying 10 8-inch guns. He also had 2 light cruisers, Tama and Abu Kuma, and a screen of destroyers. His convoy, the transports he was there to protect, had been detached to safety the moment contact with the Americans was made. His fighting ships alone outnumbered and outgunned the Americans he was about to face. On paper, this engagement should have been brief and decisive. What Hosogaya carried into the battle alongside his ships and his guns were pressures that McMorris did not face. He was operating under instructions from Tokyo that made the safety of the convoy paramount. The fighting ships existed to protect the transports, not to engage in extended gunnery duels that consumed ammunition and fuel. He had, as the battle would later reveal, concerns about his fuel supply that shaped his decision-making in ways that would prove fateful. He was also operating far from any support base, in waters where damage sustained could not be quickly repaired, at the end of a logistical chain that stretched back thousands of miles. These were not weaknesses that would show at the opening of the battle. They would only become visible much later, when the engagement had gone on far longer than anyone had anticipated. The crews of both forces were, in their own ways, products of the war they had been fighting for more than a year. The American sailors on the Salt Lake City and Richmond had spent months patrolling these waters, intercepting convoys, supporting ground operations on the Aleutian Islands. They were not fresh-faced volunteers straight from training. They were men who had learned what the North Pacific felt like from the inside of a steel hull, who knew the particular misery of standing watch in conditions where the cold came off the water in waves and the horizon could disappear in fog without warning. They were experienced, they were tired, and on the morning of the 26th, most of them had just finished breakfast when the radar changed everything. The Japanese cruiser aboard Nachi and Maya had their own history with this ocean. They had been part of the broader campaign that had established the Japanese foothold in the Aleutians. They knew these waters. They had confidence in their ships and their commanders. And as the two forces closed on each other through the grey North Pacific dawn, that confidence was, by every reasonable assessment, well-founded. The numbers said Japan wins. The firepower said Japan wins. The only things the numbers did not account for were the specific choices that specific men would make in the next 3.5 hours in conditions that no numbers could predict. Before the first gun fired, before the first shell arsed across that freezing water, the battle was already being shaped by something that neither side fully understood: the character of the men in command. McMorris's instinct to fight rather than run would define the American effort. Hosogaya's caution, his concern for fuel, for ammunition doctrine, for the consequences of losing capital ships in waters where they could not be replaced, would define the Japanese response. Neither man knew, standing on their respective bridges in the dark before dawn, that they were about to write the last chapter of a particular kind of naval warfare, the age of the pure gunnery duel, ship against ship, man against man, gun against gun, with no aircraft overhead and no submarines below, was about to end. It would end here, in these waters, on this day. History has a way of arriving unannounced. On the 26th of March, 1943, it arrived at approximately 7:30 in the morning, in the form of radar blips on the screens of two task groups that were about to discover they were not, as each had believed, alone on this ocean. Chapter 3, the stage, geography, weather, and the North Pacific as an instrument of war. before you can understand the battle, you must understand the place. Not as a location on a map. Maps flatten everything, smooth out the violence of geography, reduce 1,000-foot sea swells to a thin blue line, and fog banks to an absence of color. You must understand what it felt like to be a sailor operating in the North Pacific in the winter of 1943, because the ocean here was not a neutral stage on which the battle was performed. It was a participant. The North Pacific, in the zone around the Aleutian Islands and the Soviet Komandorski chain, is among the most consistently hostile ocean environments on Earth. Weather systems form without warning and move with extraordinary speed. Wind shifts can take a calm morning and transform it within the hour into something that makes simple navigation a physical struggle. The sea temperature in March hovers not far above freezing. A man who went overboard in these waters in 1943 had, at most, minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia began its work. There were no rescue swimmers. There were no helicopters. There was only the water. Fog was the North Pacific's particular weapon. It was not the thin, burning off by mid-morning fog of more temperate oceans. It was dense, persistent, directionally confusing fog that could reduce visibility to a matter of hundreds of yards or less. Radar, by 1943, had improved substantially from the primitive sets of the war's opening months. But radar was still an imperfect tool, subject to interference, capable of missing contacts that were closer than they should have been, and unable to provide the kind of detailed picture that a clear sky, binocular-equipped lookout could produce on a good day. In the North Pacific, good days were rare. The Komandorski Islands themselves sit in the North Pacific, roughly 150 miles west of the westernmost point of Attu Island. They are a Soviet, in 1943, controlled archipelago, wind-battered and largely barren, of almost no value in themselves, except as a geographic reference point, and a reminder that the Soviet Union was, just here, very close to the action. The proximity of Soviet territory was a factor both sides were aware of. The last thing either Tokyo or Washington wanted was an incident that drew the Soviets into a confrontation they had carefully kept themselves out of in the Pacific theater. The battle would be fought in international waters, but the shadow of Soviet territory was always visible on the charts. The tactical implications of the geography were significant. There was no land nearby to provide cover. There was no shallow water into which a damaged ship could retreat. There were no ports, no repair facilities, no beaches to ground a sinking vessel on. If you were hit badly enough out here, you were on your own. Your crew had to manage the damage with what was aboard the ship. Your engineers had to solve problems that had not been written up in any maintenance manual with the tools they had in conditions that were already pushing every mechanical system to its limit. This was not a battle where a ship could absorb serious damage and then limp back to a nearby anchorage. Every hit counted. Every flood, every fire, every structural failure was its own crisis, requiring its own improvised solution. For the American task group, the geographic situation was particularly acute. McMorris's ships were operating at the far end of their patrol range. Fuel was a constant concern. The nearest American base of any significance was many hundreds of miles away. Air support, the kind that might, in more southerly Pacific operations, be called in to finish off a damaged enemy or deter a pursuing force, was simply not available. The Army Air Forces operated from Aleutian airfields that were themselves at the edge of operational viability, plagued by the same weather that plagued everything else in this part of the world. On the morning of the 26th, No American aircraft were in the air over the battle area. No American submarines were positioned to intervene. McMorris had exactly the ships under his command and nothing else. The Japanese force was better placed, in the sense that Hosogaya's ships were nominally fresher and his logistical situation, while strained, was not as immediately critical as McMorris's. But the fundamental geographic isolation applied to both sides equally. Whatever happened out here, it would happen without outside intervention, without reinforcement, without the cavalry arriving from anywhere. The battle would be fought and decided by the ships and men already on the water. That isolation, that pure, undiluted quality of the confrontation, is what makes Komandorski unique, even among the extraordinary variety of naval engagements that the Second World War produced. The weather on the morning of the 26th was, by North Pacific standards, relatively cooperative. Visibility was better than average, clear enough for lookouts to sight ships at several miles' distance, and for the cruisers spotting aircraft when they were eventually launched to function. The sea was rough but manageable. There was wind, as there was always wind out here, but nothing that would prevent the ships from maneuvering. In another sense, the weather was already making its preferences known. The low, grey overcast sky and the long, rolling swells of a North Pacific winter morning gave the scene a quality that photographs from the era capture only imperfectly. A bleakness, a severity, a sense that this ocean had seen many things and cared about none of them. Into that bleakness, just before dawn on the 26th, two task forces were moving toward a meeting that neither had fully anticipated. McMorris's ships were strung out in a scouting line roughly 6 miles long, steering north by northeast, 100 miles south of the nearest Komandorski Island and 180 miles due west of Attu. The men had finished breakfast. They were moving to dawn general quarters, the routine morning preparation that every warship observed in contested waters, the ritual acknowledgement that the hour before and after sunrise was historically the most dangerous time at sea. General quarters meant battle stations. It meant the ship sealed itself, compartment by compartment, into something resembling readiness. It was routine. It was, on most mornings, a precaution that produced nothing. On the morning of the 26th of March, 1943, it produced contact. Chapter 4. The intelligence that started it all. Code breaking and the decision to intercept wars are won and lost in many ways. On the battlefield, in the factory, in the supply lines that stretch across oceans and continents. But they are also won and lost in quiet rooms where men and women sit with headphones and pencils and intercept messages never meant for their ears. Then spend hours and days translating those messages into something that commanders in the field can use. The intelligence war, the war of codes and code breakers, of signals intercepted and decrypted, runs parallel to every other aspect of the Second World War. And at Komandorski, it was the intelligence war that set everything else in motion. American codebreakers had, by early 1943, achieved a level of penetration into Japanese naval communications that was, by the standards of the era, remarkable. The effort to break Japanese naval codes, an effort that had required years of painstaking cryptanalytic work and had produced decisive results at Midway in June of 1942, continued to provide intelligence of strategic value throughout the Pacific campaign. The specific message that triggered the Komandorski engagement was one of these intercepts. Information passed through Japanese naval communications and picked up by American monitoring stations, indicating that a supply convoy was being assembled and dispatched to reinforce the garrisons on Attu. The intelligence was passed to Hawaii. From Hawaii, the order went out to Rear Admiral McMorris: intercept and destroy the Japanese convoy. The assessment passed to McMorris was, in retrospect, incomplete in one crucial respect. It conveyed the existence of the convoy and its general composition. What it either did not convey or conveyed with insufficient clarity was the strength of the escort. McMorris was expecting a convoy with a modest defensive screen, the kind of escort that might be assembled for a routine resupply run to a garrison that was not considered a high-priority strategic asset. What Hosogaya had as embellies around his convoy was a great deal more than that. The gap between what McMorris knew and what was actually bearing down on him is one of those moments in military history where intelligence, however brilliant its acquisition, runs up against the irreducible fog of war. The codebreakers had done their job. The information had been transmitted. But between the raw intelligence and the tactical reality that McMorris would face when the radar screens lit up, there was a distance that no amount of signals traffic could fully close. He was going into the fight with one picture in his head. The ocean was going to hand him a different one. This was not a failure of the intelligence system in any simple sense. Intelligence is never perfect. It is always a reconstruction, an approximation, an estimate made from incomplete data under time pressure. The codebreakers working on Japanese naval communications were operating at the edge of what was possible, breaking codes that had been designed to resist exactly the kind of analysis they were applying to them, working in real time, producing actionable intelligence against an opponent who was also continuously changing his procedures. That any of those messages were being read at all was, from a technical standpoint, extraordinary. That the picture they produced was incomplete is simply what intelligence looks like in practice. For McMorris, the operational implication was stark. He had been ordered to intercept a convoy. He had enough ships to handle what he expected to find. What he was about to find was a force built around 2 heavy cruisers. Ships that, in terms of gunfire and armor, were in a completely different category from the light cruiser that was his flagship. The USS Richmond carried 6-inch guns. The Japanese heavy cruisers carried 8-inch guns. The difference in caliber sounds modest. The difference in destructive effect was not modest at all. An 8-inch shell is, by every measure that matters to the men on the receiving end, a categorically different weapon from a 6-inch shell, and Hosogaya had a great many of them. McMorris's ace, his one ship that could match the Japanese heavy cruisers shell for shell, was the Salt Lake City, with her own 8-inch main battery. In a battle between equals, the Salt Lake City against either Nachi or Maya would be a competitive engagement against both of them simultaneously, with 2 Japanese light cruisers adding their weight to the equation. The arithmetic was bleak. This is the situation McMorris found himself in, as the radar contacts resolved themselves in those minutes before 0800 hours on the 26th. From ambiguous blips into identifiable ships. This was not the convoy he had come to intercept. This was something else entirely. The decision he faced in those minutes was one of the most consequential snap judgments of the entire Aleutian campaign. Run, and the convoy gets through. Attu is resupplied. The Japanese position in the Aleutians is strengthened, and the strategic effort to strangle those garrisons takes a serious blow. Fight, and accept the probability of severe damage or loss to ships that the Pacific Fleet could not easily replace. McMorris had seconds, not minutes, to make this calculation, and the decision he made, to turn south, to fight a retiring action, to use his superior speed to stay at the edge of Japanese gun range, while inflicting what damage he could, was not a decision that any textbook had prepared him for. It was a decision made by a man who understood, in his bones, what the mission required. The decision to fight was, in a real sense, the last act in the intelligence drama that had set all of this in motion. The codebreakers had put McMorris in this ocean, on this morning. The incomplete picture they had given him had put him within range of a force he could not defeat in a straight fight, and his decision to fight anyway, to turn what should have been a disastrous tactical surprise into a 3.5-hour running battle, would determine not just the fate of his ships, but the fate of the Japanese garrison on Attu. The code had been broken. Now the men had to live with the consequences. Chapter 5, The Fleets, Iron, Steel, and the Science of Naval Gunnery. In 1943, Dundagall to understand what happened when the guns opened fire off the Komandorski Islands. You need to understand what a naval gunnery engagement of this type actually was. Mechanically, physically, and in terms of the human beings who operated the machinery. In the age before guided missiles, before precision-targeted bombs dropped from aircraft at altitude, naval combat between surface ships was an exercise in applied geometry conducted at extreme range under conditions of constant motion in which the probability of any individual shell hitting its target was, on its own, quite low. It was volume and persistence that produced results. And on the 26th of March, 1943, both sides were about to demonstrate what those qualities looked like at their most sustained and intense. A naval gunnery duel at distances of several miles involves a kind of math that most people find counterintuitive. The shell fired from a naval gun does not travel in a straight line to its target. It travels in an arc, climbing to an apogee, and then descending toward the waterline of the target ship. The time of flight, the seconds between the firing of the gun and the arrival of the shell, can be anywhere from several seconds to nearly a minute, depending on the range. During that time, both the firing ship and the target ship are moving. The target is almost certainly taking evasive action. The firing ship is itself maneuvering, which changes the bearing and range between the moment the gun is aimed and the moment the shell arrives. The solution to this problem, the firing solution, was computed in 1943 by crews of men working mechanical fire control systems, feeding in data on bearing, speed, range, wind, and atmospheric conditions, and producing an output that was, by definition, an estimate. Chasing salvos was the technique by which experienced naval gunners improved their firing solutions in action. When a salvo of shells landed, their fall of shot, the pattern of splashes relative to the target, told the spotters whether the shots had fallen short, over, or to one side. The fire control team adjusted accordingly. With each salvo, the solution became more refined, more accurate. It was not a mechanical process so much as a dialogue between gunners and the sea. A continuous adjustment, a closing of the gap between calculation and reality. American gunners at Komandorski were considered proficient at this technique, and the early salvos from the Salt Lake City demonstrated it. Several hits on the Nachi in the opening minutes of the engagement indicated a firing solution that had been achieved with impressive speed. The Japanese gunnery was, by all accounts, also of high quality. Hosogaya's heavy cruisers opened fire at extreme range and achieved near misses almost immediately. There were, by one later account, nearly 200 near misses recorded within 30 yards of the Salt Lake City during the course of the battle. a figure that speaks to consistent accuracy maintained over hours of firing. The fact that so many near misses did not translate into direct hits is partly a testament to the American ship's maneuvering and partly the irreducible randomness that attends all long-range naval gunfire. The gap between a near miss and a hit is, at these ranges, sometimes a matter of feet and sometimes a matter of luck that no gunnery system in the world can fully account for. The USS Salt Lake City was a Pensacola-class heavy cruiser, a design that dated from the late 1920s and represented the early years of the Washington Naval Treaty era, when naval architects were trying to squeeze the maximum possible fighting power into ships whose displacement was capped by international agreement. The result was a ship that was, in the judgment of many naval officers, somewhat top-heavy and somewhat under-armored for a heavy cruiser. A ship that carried powerful guns, but whose protection was not as comprehensive as later designs would provide. She carried 10 8-inch guns in her main battery, arranged in 2 twin turrets and 2 triple turrets, and she could fire those guns at a rate that made her capable of delivering substantial weight of metal against a target. By the time the battle ended, she had fired 806 armor-piercing projectiles and 26 high-capacity shells, a volume of fire that represented very nearly the entirety of her ammunition supply. The Japanese heavy cruisers Nachi and Maya were both Miyoko-class vessels, designed in the 1920s and substantially modernized in the years before the war. They were larger and more heavily armed than the Salt Lake City, each carrying 10 8-inch guns and a powerful torpedo armament. The Miyoko class was, in 1943, among the most capable heavy cruisers in service anywhere in the world. Hosogaya's decision to use both of them against McMorris's task group, rather than dispatching one to finish the damaged American ships while the other covered the convoy's retreat, would become one of the great tactical puzzles of the engagement. A question that historians would argue about for decades after the guns went silent. The destroyers on both sides occupied a different role in the tactical picture. Japanese destroyers made several torpedo attacks during the course of the battle. Though none succeeded in hitting an American ship, American destroyers held their torpedo fire for most of the engagement, conserving it against a moment when it might be most decisive. A moment that, as it turned out, arrived near the battle's end in dramatic fashion. The destructive potential of the destroyer torpedo, a weapon that could sink any ship afloat if it struck cleanly, was a factor that both sides had to account for in their maneuvering throughout the engagement. The threat of the torpedo, even when no torpedo was actually fired, shaped the battle in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The human beings who operated all of this machinery, the gunners, the fire control crews, the engineers, the damage control parties, were the true limiting factor in everything the ships could do. Naval machinery in 1943 was extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily demanding. Maintaining a sustained gunnery engagement over 3.5 hours required crews to keep performing at high efficiency in conditions of accumulating stress, fatigue, noise, and, as damage began to accrue, genuine danger. The engine rooms of the Salt Lake City, in the later stages of the battle, would become the site of some of the most desperate improvised engineering of the entire engagement. Men working in confined spaces, in heat and danger, on systems that were failing in ways no training exercise had prepared them for. The science of naval gunnery in 1943 was, in one sense, near the apex of its development, a culmination of a century and a half of technological refinement. In another sense, it was already becoming obsolete. The aircraft carrier had demonstrated, at Midway and Coral Sea, that the future of naval combat lay in aerial striking power, in the ability to project force at ranges that dwarfed the reach of any surface gun. The battle off the Komandorski Islands would be, in the awareness of those who understood its historical significance, the end of something. The last pure gunnery duel, fought entirely between surface ships, entirely by the old rules, gun against gun, ship against ship, man against man. What it produced in those 3.5 hours of cold Pacific morning was something that no subsequent naval engagement would quite replicate. Chapter 6, Contact. The morning of the 26th of March, 1943, 0730 hours, 180 miles due west of Attu, 100 miles south of the nearest Komandorski Island. The light, such as it was, had just begun to arrive. The flat, grey, grudging illumination of a North Pacific dawn that offered visibility without warmth and horizon, without comfort. The men of McMorris's task group were at dawn general quarters, which meant that across every ship in the formation, the Richmond leading, the Salt Lake City holding station, the 4 destroyers spread in their scouting line. Men were moving to battle stations in the same practiced, unhurried way they moved to them every morning, expecting nothing, prepared for everything, experiencing the particular combination of readiness and routine that sustained naval service demands. Then the radar screens changed. On the van destroyer and on the flagship, almost simultaneously, contact was made. 5 vessels, between 7.5 and 12 miles distant, due north. The contacts were real, solid, distinct, not the scatter and noise that sometimes confused North Pacific radar returns. 5 ships, the convoy, right where the intelligence had said it would be. For a few minutes, and it was only a few minutes, there was something approaching satisfaction in the American task group. The inch intelligence had been right. The intercept was working. The convoy was precisely where it was supposed to be, and McMorris's force was in position to engage. The plan was working. Then, as the radar picture sharpened and lookouts began confirming visual contacts through their binoculars, the picture changed. One heavy cruiser, then another, then the outline of light cruisers and destroyers behind them. The convoy was there, all right, but around it was a fighting force that no one in McMorris's task group had been prepared for. The realization arrived in stages, as it often does in combat, not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a series of incremental adjustments to understanding, each one slightly worse than the last. First, the escorts were heavier than expected. Then, how much heavier became clear. 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, multiple destroyers. A force that, in total surface firepower, was more than double what McMorris had brought to this corner of the Pacific. The men on the bridges of the American ships, watching those contacts resolve themselves from radar blips into actual warships bearing down from the north, went through whatever internal adjustment is required. When the situation you trained for turns out to be different from the situation you are actually in. McMorris's decision, made in those compressed minutes between contact and engagement, was to fight. He turned his force south and southwest, away from the Japanese, using the superior speed of his lighter ships to open range, while his ships engaged. He would not run for safety. He would not break off and concede the convoy's passage to Attu. He would fight a retiring action, drawing the Japanese after him, forcing an engagement on terms where his speed gave him some control over the distance, trying to inflict damage while avoiding the concentration of fire that would follow if the Japanese were allowed to close to decisive range. It was a decision made in seconds on a cold bridge with a clear understanding of what the alternatives meant for the larger strategic picture. At 0840 hours, before the American ships had fully organized into battle formation, the enemy opened fire. The Nazis' guns spoke first. A salvo of 8-inch shells directed at the American formation at what was, by the standards of this engagement, considerable range. The USS Richmond returned fire almost immediately. The Salt Lake City, the only American ship whose guns could genuinely reach back against the Japanese heavy cruisers, added her voice to the exchange. The gunnery duel, the last pure gunnery duel in the history of modern naval warfare, had begun. The opening phase of the battle saw the Americans perform, in the judgment of most subsequent analysts, better than the numbers suggested they should. The Salt Lake City's fire control teams achieved early hits on the Nachi. At least 2 strikes in the first minutes of the engagement that caused enough damage to temporarily reduce the Japanese flagship's effectiveness. This was not luck, or not entirely luck. It was the product of the kind of sustained professional training that American naval gunnery had emphasized through the pre-war years, and of fire control crews who had learned their trade in the specific conditions of the North Pacific. Those early hits did not change the balance of forces, but they changed the atmosphere of the engagement. The Japanese, who had every reason to expect that their superior numbers would produce quick results, found themselves dealing with an opponent who was hitting back harder than anticipated. The American formation was attempting to maintain range, staying at the edge of effective Japanese gun range, close enough to fire effectively, but far enough to complicate the Japanese fire control solution. This required constant maneuvering, constant adjustment of course and speed, a running calculation that the officers on McMorris's bridges were performing in real time against an opponent who was also maneuvering, also adjusting, and who had more sea room and more fighting power with which to work. The destroyers on both sides were active. The Japanese trying to work their way into torpedo range, the Americans trying to stay clear of that threat while keeping their own destroyers positioned for use if the opportunity arose. As the battle moved through its first hour, patterns began to establish themselves. The Japanese were not pressing as hard as their firepower suggested they could. Hosogaya's ships were maintaining a kind of measured aggression, powerful, consistent, dangerous, but not the overwhelming assault that 2 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers against 1 heavy cruiser and 1 light cruiser might theoretically deliver. The reasons for this restraint were not immediately apparent to the Americans. They would only become clear later when the battle had ended and the accounting of what each side had been carrying into the fight began to emerge. Hosogaya was thinking about fuel. He was thinking about ammunition doctrine. He was thinking about what his orders actually required of him, and those orders had never specified the annihilation of the American task group as the primary objective. They had specified the delivery of the convoy. And so the battle entered its long middle phase, a grinding, exhausting exchange of fire across cold grey water, 2 forces circling each other in a vast arc, each inflicting damage, neither achieving the decisive result that the firepower on display suggested was possible. Somewhere to the north, safely detached, the Japanese transports that had started all of this waited. On both sides, men who had trained their entire careers for exactly this kind of engagement were discovering what actual sustained naval combat felt like from the Inside, the noise, the concussion of their own guns firing, the occasional violent shudder of a hit, the smoke, the spray, the relentless demand to keep functioning precisely when every human instinct was screaming something else entirely. The battle was not yet decided. The Salt Lake City had not yet been crippled. The destroyers had not yet been ordered on their desperate last run, and Hosogaya had not yet made the decision that would define how history remembered him. All of that was still to come, accumulating in the grey North Pacific morning, like the shells that both sides were still hurling at each other across the water. The 26th of March, 1943 was still unfinished. It had barely begun. Chapter 7, The Long Chase. How a retiring action became something else entirely. There is a particular kind of military engagement that defies easy categorization. It is not a decisive clash of overwhelming forces. It is not a quick surgical strike that ends in minutes. It is something slower, more grinding, more psychologically demanding than either of those things. A sustained running fight in which both sides are doing their calculations in real time, adjusting their plans on the fly, trying to force an outcome that the situation keeps refusing to deliver. The battle off the Komandorski Islands, from its opening salvos to its extraordinary conclusion, was exactly that kind of fight, and nowhere was that quality more apparent than in the long middle phase. The hours between initial contact and crisis, when McMorris's task group found itself not escaping, not winning, but simply enduring. When McMorris turned his force southwest after the initial contact on the morning of the 26th of March, 1943, his intention was tactically straightforward. He would use his ship's speed advantage to stay at the margins of effective Japanese gun range. He would keep the Salt Lake City firing, keep punishing the Japanese formation, keep their gunnery officers dealing with a moving, responding target rather than a stationary one. He would not let the Japanese close to the short ranges, where their overwhelming numerical advantage would become decisive. And somewhere in this calculation was the faint hope, not a plan, exactly, but an awareness that if he could keep this going long enough, something might change. Fuel, for instance, or ammunition, or the intervention of factors that neither side could predict from the opening positions. What he could not have fully anticipated was that the Japanese response to his retiring action would be so measured, so careful, so frustratingly short of the all-out assault that Hosogaya's firepower should have allowed him to deliver. The two Japanese heavy cruisers, Nachi and Maya, were more than capable of pouring fire into the American formation at the rates that would have overwhelmed McMorris's damage control capabilities within the first hour. Instead, Hosogaya maintained a pursuit that was aggressive enough to keep the Americans under fire, but disciplined enough to avoid the reckless closing of range that might have decided the battle quickly. From his bridge, this was sound professional judgment. From McMorris's bridge, trying to read the situation through the smoke and spray and the reports coming up from the ship's spotters, it was profoundly disorienting, like being chased by something that could run faster than you, but chose, for its own reasons, not to. The pursuit stretched across miles of North Pacific water, the two formations maintaining their rough separation. The Japanese always pressing from the north and northeast, the Americans steering south and southwest. The Salt Lake City and Richmond firing steadily, the Japanese cruisers responding in kind. The geometry of the engagement shifted constantly as both sides maneuvered. McMorris needed to keep the Japanese at a range where his own guns could reach them. The Japanese needed to close enough to bring the full weight of their fire to bear without allowing the Americans to slip away entirely. In the early hours, neither side achieved what they were trying to achieve, which meant that the battle continued. Grinding, loud, exhausting, and inconclusive in its immediate results. The destroyers on both sides were active throughout this phase. Japanese destroyers made repeated attempts to close to torpedo range on the American formation, forcing McMorris to maneuver in response and diverting attention from the gunnery exchange. American destroyers screened the cruisers, occasionally fired at long range with their own guns, largely without effect at these distances, and waited for orders that would call them to a more decisive role. The movement of the destroyers added layers of complexity to an already complex tactical situation. Every turn made to avoid a torpedo threat changed the firing solutions the gun crews had been building. Every shift in the formation's course required the fire control teams to recalculate. The battle was not one engagement, but dozens of overlapping sub-engagements, each demanding its own response, each consuming the attention of officers and crews who had already been at battle stations for more than an hour. Through this phase, the Salt Lake City was doing the heavy lifting on the American side. The Richmond's 6-inch guns were simply outranged by the Japanese heavy cruisers. She could fire, and she did, but her shells were reaching the outer edge of their effective envelope, while the Nachi and Maya were still well within theirs. The Salt Lake City, with her own 8-inch battery, was the only American ship that could genuinely punish the Japanese at the ranges at which this battle was being fought. Her fire control crews were working with sustained intensity, adjusting constantly, chasing the solution across the moving geometry of the engagement. Early hits had established that the solution was achievable. Maintaining it, under fire, over hours, was a different kind of challenge, one that demanded everything the crew had brought to this morning. The strain was not only mechanical, the psychological weight of a sustained engagement, the knowledge that the next salvo might find you, that the splash rising beside the hull might, on the next fall of shot, be a hit rather than a near miss, was something that training could prepare you for in theory and could not fully prepare you for in practice. Across the American ships, damage control parties stood ready at their stations, waiting for the kind of call that would put everything they had learned to the test. On the bridges, officers tracked the tactical picture through binoculars, through radar reports, through the reports coming in from lookouts, and from the spotters observing the fall of shot. The information they were processing was incomplete, imperfect, and constantly changing. The decisions they were making on the basis of that information were, in real time, irreversible. That is what it means to command in battle. And it is what McMorris and his officers were doing, without pause, across those first hours of the engagement. The Japanese formation had advantages that were not purely numerical. Hosogaya's 2 heavy cruisers, firing together, could bracket a target, divide the task of finding the firing solution between 2 independent fire control teams, then concentrate their weight once one of them had achieved accuracy. The Americans, with only 1 heavy cruiser capable of matching the Japanese caliber, had no equivalent capability. McMorris's tactical task was thus asymmetric in a way that went beyond mere numbers. He had to keep 1 ship doing the work that should, by the logic of surface warfare, require at least 2. The Salt Lake City was being asked to be, simultaneously, the striking power and the primary target of the American formation. She was absorbing the attention of the Japanese gunnery teams, precisely because she was the ship that most needed to be silenced. By late morning, The battle had now been going on for more than 2 hours. The American task group had covered substantial distance, south and southwest from the point of initial contact. The Japanese had maintained their pursuit, keeping the Americans under consistent fire. The Salt Lake City had taken hits, the exact timing and specific details of which hits arrived in which sequence was a matter that survivors and damage reports would later reconstruct. And her damage control parties had been dealing with the consequences. Nothing catastrophic had happened yet. Nothing had ended the fight. But the cumulative weight of the engagement was beginning to tell in the way that sustained gunfire always tells. Through the progressive degradation of systems, through the accumulating fatigue of crews, through the narrowing of the margins that had kept the ship fighting for hours. The long chase had not resolved anything. It had instead created the conditions for a crisis. For the moment when all the near misses and manageable damage and improvised repairs would no longer be sufficient, when something would give way, and the character of the battle would change entirely. That moment was coming. The men aboard the Salt Lake City, working their damage control stations and their gunnery systems with the focused intensity of professionals who understood what was at stake, did not know exactly when it would arrive. But the physics of the situation, the relentless accumulation of hits, the progressive exhaustion of fuel and ammunition, the demands being placed on systems that had been at their operational limit since before the battle started, were writing the crisis into the fabric of the morning, as surely as the shells were writing their own story in the North Pacific Sea. Chapter 8, Hit After Hit, the Salt Lake City fights for her life. There is a point in a naval engagement when a ship transitions from fighting a battle to simply surviving one. It is not a point that appears on any tactical chart or operational order. It arrives without announcement, driven by the accumulation of damage, the depletion of options, and the weight of hours spent absorbing punishment that was never designed to be absorbed indefinitely. For the USS Salt Lake City, on the morning of the 26th of March 1943, that transition came in stages. Each hit a step further along a path that her crew was fighting with everything they had to keep from reaching its logical end. The Salt Lake City had been under fire since the opening minutes of the engagement. Japanese gunnery, methodical, professional, delivered by fire control teams operating systems of high quality aboard ships that were among the best in the world at this type of surface. Engagement had been ranging on her consistently throughout the chase. Near misses had been constant. The number of shells that fell within a small number of yards of her hull during the course of the battle represents a sustained accuracy that, in any other engagement, would have produced catastrophic results within the first hour. That it took as long as it did to achieve the kind of damage that would bring the Salt Lake City to a stop is a combination of the American ships maneuvering, the inherent unpredictability of long-range naval gunfire, and something that has no technical name, but that sailors throughout history have simply called stubbornness. The hits that did connect told their own story. Each shell that found the Salt Lake City's hull added its weight to the damage control problem, started a fire, ruptured a compartment, damaged a system that something else depended on. Naval ships of this era were complex mechanical organisms in which every system was connected to several others. Damage to a fuel line affected the engines. Damage to an electrical system affected the pumps. Damage to the pumps affected the ability to fight flooding. The inability to fight flooding affected the ship's stability and therefore her ability to maneuver. A skilled damage control party could manage these cascades, one at a time, improvising solutions to problems that no manual had anticipated. But the cascade grows faster than the solutions when the hits keep coming, and on this morning, the hits kept coming. The engine rooms of the Salt Lake City became, as the battle progressed, the center of a drama that was entirely separate from the gunnery duel being fought on the surface above. The men working down there, the engineers and their crews, the firemen and machinists who kept the ship's propulsion alive, were dealing with problems that arrived without warning and demanded immediate creative response. The heat, the noise, the confined space, the knowledge of what was happening above them and around them. These were the conditions in which they worked, and the work they were doing was the work that kept the ship in the fight. Without the engines, the Salt Lake City stopped. If she stopped, she died. It was that simple and that relentless. At some point in the latter phase of the battle, after more than 2 hours of sustained engagement, the Salt Lake City's engineering plant suffered a failure that was not, in the first instance, caused directly by enemy fire. Water had contaminated her fuel supply. The specifics of how this happened, whether through battle damage to fuel tanks or through a flooding, related contamination, were the subject of later technical review. But the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The engines lost power, the ship slowed. And on a morning when every knot of speed was the margin between staying at fighting range and being overtaken, slowing down was not a tactical inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. The USS Salt Lake City came to what witnesses described as essentially a full stop in the water. For those watching from the bridge of the Richmond and from the destroyers, the sight of the heavy cruiser losing way, smoke pouring from her, her speed bleeding away to almost nothing, was the kind of moment that combat training prepares you for intellectually, and nothing else prepares you for emotionally. She was stopped. The Japanese ships were still coming. Between the stopped American cruiser and the pursuing Japanese formation, there was nothing but open water and the rapidly diminishing range that the chase had been designed to maintain. In the engine rooms of the Salt Lake City, the men who understood what stopping meant worked with a speed and focus that the later accounts describe in terms that do not do justice to what it actually required. They were solving, in real time, under fire, in a damaged ship, a fuel contamination problem that in a peacetime environment would have required the ship to return to port. They had no such option. They had the tools on hand, the knowledge in their heads, and whatever time the battle was going to give them, before the range closed to the point where the debate was academic. The engineering teams drained, shifted, and restored fuel supply through heroic improvisation, work that has received less historical attention than the gunnery duel above. But that was, in the most direct sense, what saved the ship. While the engineering teams worked below, the situation above was reaching its most critical point. The range between the stopped Salt Lake City and the advancing Japanese formation was closing in a way that Hosogaya's fire control teams could not have failed to recognize. A stopped ship at closing range is, in gunnery terms, an almost ideal target. The solution simplifies dramatically. The time of flight shortens. The probability of hits rises sharply. Hosogaya had what looked, from the bridge of the Nachi, like the decisive moment the battle had been building toward for more than 2.5 hours. He had a stopped enemy heavy cruiser in his sights. He had 2 heavy cruisers and a full complement of lighter ships to finish the work. What happened next? And it is one of the most examined questions in the historiography of this engagement is that Hosogaya did not close to finish the job. He pressed, but he did not press decisively. The reasons why will be examined in detail in a later chapter because they require their own unpacking. But in the immediate tactical picture, the Salt Lake City's engines came back to life. The engineering teams had done what they had been asked to do, what no training exercise had specifically prepared them for. She began to make way again. Slowly, then with gathering speed, the ship resumed her place in the American formation. The guns resumed firing. The crisis had not passed. The ship was damaged, her ammunition was running low, and the Japanese were still there. But she was alive. She was moving, and the battle was not over. The men who brought those engines back online, in the belly of a stopped ship under fire in the most remote stretch of ocean in the Northern Hemisphere, did not receive, in the immediate aftermath, the kind of recognition that battle heroics typically generate. The gunnery duel was visible. The engineering miracle was not. But those two facts are inseparable. The guns that kept firing, the ship that kept moving, the battle that kept going. All of it rested on what happened in those engine rooms, when the ship went quiet in the water, and the Japanese guns were finding the range. The engineering department of the Salt Lake City, on the 26th of March, 1943, saved their ship. That is not an overstatement. It is simply what happened. Chapter 9, The Destroyer Charge, when small ships faced impossible odds. Every war produces moments when men are asked to do things that the mathematics of survival suggests they should not survive. Some of those moments are the result of desperation, of the last option being taken when all others are exhausted. Some are the result of orders given by commanders who understand, with cold clarity, that the situation requires a sacrifice, that something must be offered to buy the time that a larger objective demands. The destroyer charge of the 26th of March, 1943, was both of these things simultaneously. It was a desperate measure, and it was ordered by a man who understood exactly what he was asking. When the Salt Lake City stopped in the water and the Japanese formation began to close, McMorris faced the starkest calculation of his command. His heavy cruiser was dead in the water, or close to it. The Richmond was a light cruiser whose guns could not match the Japanese heavies at any range that now remained tactically relevant. The Japanese were closing. In the time that would elapse before the Salt Lake City could resume speed, if she resumed speed, the range would close, to the point where the Japanese would have a clear, relatively static target at close range, and the outcome of the engagement would be decided quickly and badly for the Americans. McMorris needed time. The only thing between the stopped Salt Lake City and the Japanese formation was seawater and 4 destroyers. He ordered the destroyers in, all 4 of them, USS Bailey, USS Coglan, USS Dale, and USS Monaghan, were directed to advance toward the Japanese formation, to fire their torpedoes, and to do whatever was necessary to force the Japanese to turn away and break up their firing runs. In the language of naval tactics, this is described as a torpedo attack. In the language of reality, it was 4 lightly armed ships with thin armor and limited firepower being sent at 2 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers and a screen of destroyers, with the expectation that some or all of the attacking ships would not return. McMorris knew this. The destroyer commanders knew this, and they went. The USS Bailey led the charge, her captain pushing her to the full extent of her speed, closing the range toward the Japanese formation at a rate that must have seemed, from the bridges of the Japanese ships, like something between audacity and madness. The Japanese responded immediately with concentrated fire. Salvos directed at the advancing destroyers, trying to sink them before they reached torpedo release range. The sea around the charging American ships erupted with shell splashes. The destroyers maneuvered wildly, making themselves as difficult a target as possible, not turning back, pressing the attack with everything their engines had. The USS Bailey was hit multiple times. She took shell fire that would have stopped a less determined vessel and kept coming. Her guns were firing. Her captain had his eye on the torpedo solution, on the range, on the geometry that would give him the best chance of hitting something large and valuable with the weapons his ship carried. The other destroyers were also under fire, also maneuvering, also pressing in. The Japanese ships, faced with 4 destroyers attacking in a coordinated run, threatening torpedo hits that could cripple or sink any ship afloat, had to respond. They could not simply ignore the threat and maintain their fire on the stopped Salt Lake City. Torpedoes in the water change everything. A cruiser that takes a torpedo hit loses effectiveness at minimum, and at worst, ceases to be a cruiser at all. The Japanese ships turned, not in panic, not in rout, but in the controlled, professional recognition that the tactical situation required dealing with the destroyer threat before it could be resolved against them. In turning to unmask their torpedo fire and engage the attacking destroyers, they momentarily disrupted the gunnery solutions they had been building against the Salt Lake City. The range between the Japanese heavy cruisers and the stopped American cruiser stabilized for a crucial few minutes. Those minutes were the ones that the Salt Lake City's engineering teams were using to bring the engines back. Not all of the torpedoes fired by the American destroyers hit their targets. In the record of the engagement, no Japanese ships were sunk or crippled by destroyer torpedo fire in this phase of the battle. But the tactical effect of the charge was not measured in hit rates. It was measured in time. The precious minutes that the disruption of the Japanese formation bought while the Salt Lake City came back to life. The destroyers had not been sent in to sink the Japanese. They had been sent in to change the tactical picture long enough for the American formation to survive a crisis. By that measure, by the only measure that actually mattered in those minutes, the charge succeeded. The USS Bailey, damaged, was still afloat when the firing stopped. All 4 destroyers came back. They came back damaged. They came back with the marks of the fire they had absorbed on hulls and superstructures. But they came back. The fact that they all came back is, in itself, a remarkable outcome given what they had been sent to do and what had been arrayed against them. Naval warfare in 1943 was not generally forgiving of destroyer forces attacking heavy cruiser formations at close range. That morning, in those waters, 4 American destroyers found the gap between what the mathematics said should happen and what actually did. The men who served on those 4 ships, the officers who drove them at the Japanese formation, the torpedo men who readied and fired the weapons, the engine room crews who pushed the machinery to its limits, the damage control parties who worked on flooding and fires, while the ship was still under fire, were doing something that had no polite name in the professional vocabulary of naval warfare. They were buying time with their lives, and they knew it. The orders were clear. The situation was clear. What was not clear, what could not have been clear to any man on any of those 4 ships as they closed the range toward the Japanese guns, was whether the time they bought would be enough. It was enough, by margins that no tactical formula could have predicted, by the narrowest of windows. It was enough. The Salt Lake City's engines came back. The American formation reformed. The battle continued, and the 4 destroyers that had been sent on what looked, from every available angle, like a mission from which they might not return. Those 4 ships found their way back into the formation, damaged but whole, their part in the morning's work not yet fully understood, not yet properly honoured, but done. Done in the way that the best military service is done. Completely, without reservation, and with the full knowledge of what was being asked. Hosogaya's hesitation. The decision that changed everything. Military history is full of moments when the stronger force did not press its advantage. The reasons are always specific to the man, the moment, and the situation. But the pattern repeats across centuries of warfare, with an insistence that suggests something structural about the way human beings make decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty. At Komandorski, the defining moment of that kind belongs entirely to Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya. He had, in the latter stage of the battle, what looked by every available measure like the decisive advantage, and he did not take it. Understanding why requires understanding not just the tactical picture, but the web of pressures, constraints, and calculations that surrounded every decision he made on that morning. Hosogaya's position on the morning of the 26th of March was, on its surface, one of considerable strength. His 2 heavy cruisers outgunned the American force in caliber and weight of broadside. His numerical advantage in lighter ships was substantial. The American heavy cruiser had been stopped, temporarily dead in the water, and the range had been closing in a way that should have allowed him to finish the engagement decisively. His crews had been performing well. The sustained accuracy of Japanese gunnery throughout the morning had consistently troubled the American formation, scoring hits on the Salt Lake City and keeping the American task group under pressure. Everything suggested that pressing the attack would produce the result that the numbers had been promising since the moment of first contact. And yet, Hosogaya chose not to press. He chose, at the critical moment, to break off the engagement and turn the Japanese formation away from the Americans. The decision was made, and this is where historians have focused much of their subsequent analysis, not because the tactical situation demanded it, but because of factors that had nothing directly to do with the battle being fought. Fuel was one of them. Hosogaya was acutely aware of the fuel state of his ships, operating at the far end of their range in waters where no resupply was possible. An extended engagement that consumed significant additional fuel would, in his calculation, leave his force in a position of potentially dangerous vulnerability on the return voyage. This was not an irrational concern. It was a real constraint, and he was right to be aware of it. Ammunition was the second factor. The sustained gunnery exchange had consumed substantial quantities of main battery ammunition on both sides. Hosogaya had standing orders, the kind of orders that reflected hard lessons learned earlier in the Pacific War about the consequences of expending ammunition in drawn-out surface engagements. That cautioned against depleting his magazines in circumstances where the strategic return was uncertain. He had not been sent to destroy an American task group. He had been sent to escort a convoy to Attu. The convoy had been safely detached when contact was made. The mission, in a narrow operational sense, had already been interrupted. The question was whether destroying the American ships was worth the additional cost in fuel and ammunition and potential damage. The third factor, and the one that historians have found most difficult to quantify, was the psychological weight of uncertainty. Hosogaya did not know that the Salt Lake City was running low on ammunition, He did not know that the American formation was as strained and depleted as it actually was. What he knew was that the American ships had been fighting aggressively for more than 3 hours, that his own ships had taken hits, and that the engagement had been far more costly than the initial assessment had suggested. There had been American aircraft reported, Army Air Forces aircraft, called up from the Aleutian airfields that were said to be en route to the battle area. The report was accurate. Aircraft had been scrambled. Whether they would arrive in time to intervene was unclear. But the possibility of air attack, added to the accumulated costs of the engagement, added to the fuel and ammunition concerns, produced a picture that Hosogaya read as one in which continued engagement was no longer clearly to Japan's advantage. He turned north. The Japanese formation, in good order, disengaged from the Americans and headed away from the battle area. The guns went silent. The chase that had defined the morning's engagement reversed itself. Now it was the Japanese ships withdrawing, and the Americans, stunned and exhausted, watching them go. The battle that had begun before 0800 hours that morning ended. In its main phase, somewhere around noon, 3.5 hours of sustained gunnery. More than 800 rounds fired by the Salt Lake City alone. A destroyer charge that should not have succeeded as well as it did. And now, silence. The reaction in the American formation was not, by all accounts, one of triumphant celebration. There was exhaustion, relief, disbelief, and the peculiar hollowness that follows the ending of extreme stress. The men who had spent 3.5 hours doing the work of that morning, the gunners, the engineers, the damage control parties, the officers on the bridges, were wrung out in ways that are difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced sustained combat. The guns were cooling. The damage was there to be assessed. The dead and wounded were there to be counted, and the Japanese were withdrawing across the grey water. The immediate American assessment of the outcome was cautious, uncertain of exactly what had been achieved and what it meant. McMorris had not destroyed the Japanese convoy. He had not sunk any Japanese ships. He had fought a 3.5-hour engagement against a superior force and had not been destroyed himself, which was, by the arithmetic of the situation, a genuine achievement. But the full significance of what had happened would only emerge in the weeks that followed as the consequences of the engagement. Specifically, Jose's decision to break off played out in the larger strategic picture of the Aleutian campaign. For Hosogaya, personally, the decision to withdraw would have consequences that followed him for the rest of his career. Tokyo's reaction to the disengagement was not gentle. An officer who had commanded a superior force, who had had the enemy within what looked like decisive range, who had then chosen to withdraw without achieving the destruction of the American task group. That officer had questions to answer. Hosogaya answered them before a review board. The finding was that his decisions had been insufficiently aggressive. He was relieved of his command. He never held another major operational assignment for the remainder of the war. The Japanese Navy, in its institutional judgment, decided that Hosogaya had made the wrong choice in the critical moment of the 26th of March. Whether that judgment was entirely fair is a question that the specific details of the tactical situation complicate considerably. But fair or not, it was the judgment that history recorded. The irony embedded in Hosogaya's story is one of the sharpest in the entire Komandorski narrative. He had every reason, in a narrow calculation of risk and resource, to make the decision he made. His concerns about fuel and ammunition were real. His awareness of the potential air threat was reasonable. His reading of the engagement, that it had cost more than anticipated, and that decisive results were no longer achievable at acceptable cost, was not obviously wrong. What he did not know, could not have known, was that, on the other side of the engagement, the Americans were nearly as depleted as he feared. The Salt Lake City was down to near the bottom of her ammunition supply. The destroyers were damaged. McMorris's formation was, in truth, very close to the end of its ability to continue fighting. The thing that Hosogaya turned away from was a force that was, in material terms, nearly broken. He turned away from a victory that was closer than he knew. Chapter 11, Silence and Aftermath. What the guns left behind. When the guns go quiet after a battle of this length and intensity, there is a transition that no one who has not experienced it can fully understand from the outside. The noise of sustained naval gunnery, the concussive thunder of main battery fire, the crack of incoming rounds, the impact sounds of hits, the roar of the engines being pushed hard. These sounds have been the entire world of every man aboard every ship for 3.5 hours. When they stop, the silence is not peaceful. It is disorienting. It arrives like a physical change in the atmosphere, and the men who have been living inside that noise find themselves in something that feels less like peace and more like the aftermath of an explosion. Everything continues. The damage control, the medical treatment, the navigation, the operational reporting. But it continues in a silence that does not feel earned. McMorris's first obligation after the engagement was to establish the material condition of his ships. The Salt Lake City had been hit multiple times and had suffered damage to her hull, her systems, and her crew. The precise toll, in terms of specific damage and casualties, was assembled from the reports of department heads and damage control parties in the hours following the action. She was damaged but afloat and capable of making way under her own power. The engineering miracle that had brought her back from the stopped condition in the battle's crucial phase had held. The repairs improvised under fire were holding. She was not in any condition to fight another engagement soon, but she had survived this one, and that was the only thing that mattered in the immediate aftermath. The USS Bailey, which had led the destroyer charge and absorbed the most concentrated fire of the 4 attacking destroyers, had been hit. Her damage was significant enough to affect her operational readiness, but she was afloat and moving. The other 3 destroyers, Coghlan, Dale, and Monaghan, had come through the charge with varying degrees of damage, none of them so severe as to prevent them from operating. The American task group, taken together, was damaged, depleted in ammunition, short on fuel, and exhausted, but it was intact. Every ship that had entered the engagement had survived it. That fact would only register in its full significance when the numbers of the engagement were placed against each other. The Japanese formation had fared better in terms of damage to individual ships. Hosogaya's heavier armor and his numerical advantage had limited the American ability to score the kind of concentrated hits that might have crippled one of his cruisers. The Anachi had taken early hits from the Salt Lake City that had reduced her effectiveness in the opening phase, but she had continued fighting and had not been critically damaged. Japanese casualties, in terms of personnel losses, were, in the subsequent accounting, heavier than American casualties. The engagement had not been, for the Japanese, the quick, low-cost operation that the initial assessment of the balance of forces had suggested it should be. Every account that has examined the Japanese records of the engagement notes the gap between what the force should have been capable of achieving and what it actually achieved. That gap is the measure of what the American performance on the 26th of March actually meant. The human cost on the American side was real, but given the intensity of the engagement, remarkably limited. Men had been killed and wounded. The specific toll, as recorded in the action reports and casualty records of the participating ships, represents the irreducible human price of those 3.5 hours. Every one of those men had been doing something specific when they became a casualty. At a gun station, in a damage control party, at an engineering position. They were not statistics when they were alive. They should not be reduced to statistics in the telling of this story. They were professionals who showed up at their battle stations on a cold North Pacific morning and did everything their training and their service demanded of them. The intelligence and operational implications of the aftermath were complex. McMorris had been sent to stop a convoy. The convoy had not been sunk. The Japanese transports had been detached at the first sign of contact and had returned safely to their base without ever entering the engagement. In a narrow operational sense, did the convoy get through? The answer was no, but not because the Americans had sunk it. It had turned back on its own. Attu had not been resupplied on the 26th of March, but it remained unresupplied, not because the convoy had been destroyed, but because Hosogaya had decided, in the face of the American resistance, that the cost of completing the run was too high. The immediate reporting of the battle, the action reports filed by McMorris and his captains, the communications that went back to Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor, established the American account of what had happened. McMorris was careful in his claims. He did not overstate what had been achieved. He reported the facts. Contact had been made with a superior Japanese force. A 3.5-hour engagement had followed. The Japanese had withdrawn, and his task group had survived with damage, but without the loss of any ship. That was the record. What it meant strategically would take more than a day to become clear. The Japanese side had its own accounting to do. Hosogaya's report to his superiors in Tokyo was the beginning of the process that would end his career. The reaction at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters to the news that a force of the composition Hosogaya had commanded had failed to destroy a substantially inferior American task group was not sympathetic to the operational complications that had shaped his decisions. The broad institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1943 was not one that easily accommodated explanations of why an advantage had not been pressed. The reasoning that had seemed sound to Hosogaya on his bridge, the fuel, the ammunition, the air threat, did not translate well into the post-action review environment in Tokyo. He was gone from his command within weeks. The ships themselves carried the marks of the morning for weeks afterward. The Salt Lake City would require repairs that took her out of service for a period before she could return to operations. The work done in those yards, the welding and patching, the replacement of damaged systems, the restoration of what the battle had degraded, was a continuation, in a different form, of the work that had been done in her engine rooms and damage control stations during the fight itself. The ship was repaired. She went back to service. She fought again in other waters, in other engagements, with crew members who carried the 26th of March inside them, in whatever way that day had worked on each of them individually. The battle was over. What came after it, the strategic consequences, the historical significance, the fate of the Aleutian campaign that the engagement had helped to decide, was a story that would take months more to complete. But the guns were quiet. The ships were moving south and east, toward port, toward repair, toward whatever came next. And in the grey North Pacific water, the long rolling swells moved through the battle area as they had moved through it before the guns opened fire, and as they would move through it long after everyone who had been there was gone. The ocean does not keep score, but the men who had been in that water on that morning knew what had happened, and they carried it with them. Chapter 12, The Strategic Verdict. How a drawn battle decided a campaign. Twente naval history is filled with battles, whose immediate tactical outcome and whose long-term strategic significance point in opposite directions. Engagements that looked, on the day, like defeats turned out to be the pivots on which entire campaigns turned. Engagements that looked like victories turned out to be too costly in ships or men or time to sustain the broader effort they were supposed to support. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands belongs firmly in this category of apparently ambiguous results that clarify over time into something more definitive. The guns went quiet with no ships sunk on either side, with the convoy undelivered and the Japanese withdrawing, a result that neither side could honestly call a clean victory. But the weeks that followed the 26th of March made the strategic meaning of the engagement unmistakable. The immediate strategic effect was on the supply situation of the Japanese garrison on Attu. The island had been waiting for the convoy that Hosogaya's force had been escorting. The garrison was already short of supplies, food, ammunition, equipment that weeks of isolation had reduced to levels that affected combat readiness. The failure of the convoy to reach Attu on the 26th of March meant that those supplies did not arrive. The question was whether another convoy would be attempted, and if so, when. In Tokyo, the answer to that question was shaped directly by the aftermath of the Komandorski engagement, by Hosogaya's relief from command, by the cost of the action, and by the escalating American pressure on the Aleutian theatre that the engagement had demonstrated was capable of making resupply very expensive. The answer that Tokyo ultimately gave was that surface convoys to Attu were no longer viable. The risk, as demonstrated by the fact that a numerically inferior American force had been willing and able to challenge a powerful Japanese escort group, was too high. The Japanese turned to submarines for their resupply efforts, attempting to use undersea transport to maintain their Aleutian garrisons in the absence of surface convoy capability. Submarine supply operations could deliver some material, but were severely limited in capacity compared to a surface convoy. The trickle of supplies that reached Attu by submarine in the weeks following Komandorski was a fraction of what the garrison needed. The gap between what the garrison required and what it was receiving grew steadily wider. American planning for a ground assault on Attu was already underway before the Komandorski engagement. The battle did not initiate that planning, but it decisively affected the conditions under which the assault would eventually take place. When American forces landed on Attu in May of 1943, 6 weeks after the battle off the Komandorski Islands, they were landing against a garrison that had been effectively cut off from supply for the intervening period. The men of the Japanese Attu garrison were short of food, short of ammunition, short of the equipment that might have made the American landing a far more costly operation. The supply chain that should have sustained them had been broken, and it had been broken at the Komandorski Islands. On the 26th of March, the Attu campaign itself, when it came, was brutal by any measure. The terrain was volcanic and unforgiving. The weather was the North Pacific at its most aggressive. American forces, many of them not trained for the specific conditions of Aleutian combat, suffered significant casualties in the weeks of fighting that followed the landing. The Japanese garrison fought with the ferocity of men who knew, by the time the Americans came ashore, that no reinforcement was coming, and that the only available outcomes were victory, which was not possible, or death in battle, which was. The fighting on Attu was among the most intense and costly of any operation in the Aleutian campaign, and it produced a final Japanese stand, a last organized charge by the garrison's surviving fighters. That became one of the largest such charges of the Pacific War. The relevance of Komandorski to Attu is not always made explicit in general histories of the Pacific War, which tend to treat these engagements as separate episodes, rather than as links in a connected chain of cause and effect. But the connection is direct. The failed convoy, the broken supply line, the weakened garrison, the Japanese decision to abandon surface resupply. All of this flows from what happened in those waters on the 26th of March. McMorris's task group did not win the Battle of the Komandorski Islands in the conventional sense, but it won something more durable than a conventional victory. It won the conditions that determined what came next. The broader Aleutian campaign, the effort to reclaim the only North American soil occupied by Japan during the Second World War, reached its conclusion in August of 1943, with the American landings on Kiska, which the Japanese had already evacuated by sea, in a remarkable operation conducted under the cover of fog. The entire Japanese presence in the Aleutian Islands, which had begun with the landings of June 1942, and which had been sustained at considerable cost in men, ships, and material through the subsequent months, ended not with a decisive final battle, but with an evacuation. A quiet, skillful withdrawal that left the Americans landing on an island that had already been emptied of defenders. The sequence that produced this outcome runs through the Komandorski engagement at every link. The Battle of the 26th of March did not, by itself, determine that the Japanese would lose the Aleutians, but it materially reduced the Japanese ability to sustain their position, accelerated the deterioration of the Attu garrison, and demonstrated, to both sides, that American surface forces in the North Pacific were capable of a tenacity and effectiveness that Japanese planning had not fully accounted for. That demonstration had consequences that went beyond the immediate tactical outcome and beyond even the Aleutian campaign itself. It was information about American fighting capability and American resolve that Tokyo had to incorporate into its assessment of what it was dealing with in the broader Pacific. For McMorris and the men of his task group, the strategic vindication that came in the weeks and months after the 26th of March was not the kind they could have seen clearly from the decks of their damaged ships on the afternoon of the battle. They knew they had survived something they should not, by the numbers, have survived. They knew they had fought well. What they could not fully know in those first days was that what they had done mattered, that the hours of that cold North Pacific morning had shaped out outcomes that would play out across hundreds of miles and dozens of subsequent operations. That knowledge came later, assembled from the pattern of events, rather than from any single moment of revelation. The ships repaired, the crews were transferred, rested, reassigned. The battle joined the long record of Pacific naval engagements, filed in action reports and war diaries and intelligence summaries, covered briefly by the kind of press that wartime censorship allowed, and then largely forgotten in the rush of subsequent events that the war produced at an unrelenting pace. Tarawa, Kwajalein, the Marianas, the Philippine Sea, The war moved south, moved west, moved toward the confrontations that would define its final phase. The North Pacific became, once again, a side theatre, important but not the main event. And the battle that had been fought in those waters on the 26th of March, 1943, slipped below the surface of public memory, carrying its extraordinary story with it into the cold, dark water where most of history eventually ends up. Chapter 13, The Men Behind the Guns. Portraits of the sailors who fought that morning Trung. History has a structural bias toward the large and the abstract. It tends toward campaigns rather than men, toward fleet actions, rather than the specific human beings who loaded the shells and turned the valves and held the damage control hoses in the dark below the waterline. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands is no exception to this bias. For decades it was discussed, when it was discussed at all, in terms of ship classes and gun calibres and fleet dispositions. But the battle was not fought by ships. It was fought by men. Specific men with specific histories who had arrived at that particular corner of the North Pacific through chains of circumstance and decision that were entirely their own. Understanding who they were, not as a collective noun, not as the crew, but as individuals embedded in a specific time and place and set of choices, is the only way to fully understand what happened on the 26th of March, 1943. The enlisted men of the American Task Group were drawn from across the country, from the industrial cities of the Midwest, from the farming communities of the South, from the urban boroughs of the Northeast, from the coastal towns of the Pacific states. They had enlisted or been drafted at various points in the war's first year, and they had been trained with whatever urgency the Navy could manage in the early months after Pearl Harbor. A training that was, by all accounts, compressed and intensive, and not always complete. The North Pacific had finished their education in ways that no training command could have replicated. Weeks of patrol in weather that broke equipment and tested seamanship, months of living aboard ships in conditions that were physically punishing, a grinding operational tempo that left little time for the kind of rest and recovery that sustained performance in extreme situations requires. The officers of the task group carried their own specific histories. McMorris himself was a Naval Academy graduate of the class of 1912, a man whose entire professional formation had been shaped by the Navy's institutional culture, its emphasis on technical mastery and tactical discipline, and the particular confidence that comes from decades of progressive responsibility. The captains of his cruisers and destroyers had similar profiles. Academy graduates, in most cases, who had spent years learning their profession in the peace Navy and were now applying what they had learned in conditions that the peacetime Navy had never been able to fully simulate. The gap between what they had trained for and what the war was actually asking of them was real, and the men who navigated that gap most effectively were the ones whose character went beyond what any academy curriculum could teach. The captain of the Salt Lake City during the battle was Captain Bertram Rogers, a man whose performance on the 26th of March demonstrated exactly that combination of technical competence and personal steadiness that the situation required. He commanded a ship under sustained fire, managed the cascading damage control crises that the engagement produced, maintained effective gunnery output throughout the hours of the fight, and held his crew together through the critical minutes when the ship stopped and the Japanese were closing. The accounts of men who served under him during the battle describe a quality of calm authority that is easier to name than to achieve, the ability to project confidence and direction when the situation's logic is pushing toward panic. That quality, in the men who have it, is the difference between a crew that holds and a crew that fragments. The Salt Lake City's crew held, the engineering crews, the men whose work in the machinery spaces saved the ship when her engines failed, occupy a particular place in the story of the battle. They were, almost by definition, invisible to the historical record that tends to form around naval engagements. Gun crews are visible. Their actions take place on deck, in daylight, in a way that observers can record. The men who work in engine rooms and fire rooms are below the waterline, in heat and noise, doing work that requires intimate technical knowledge applied at speed under conditions of extreme stress. The record of what they did on the 26th of March exists primarily in the technical sections of the action reports. Dry, precise accounts of mechanical failures and their resolutions that strip away the human reality of what those repairs required. What those words describe, when you read them carefully and understand what they mean, is men improvising solutions to life-threatening mechanical failures while their ship was under fire in water that would have killed them within minutes if they had gone overboard. They saved the ship. The record credits them, but the record does not fully capture them. The destroyermen occupy yet another category. The men who served on Bailey, Coghlan, Dale, and Monaghan on the morning of the 26th were, in the institutional hierarchy of the Navy, aboard the smallest and most vulnerable ships in the task group. Destroyers were considered the junior partners in any surface engagement. Fast and useful but fragile, expected to screen and support rather than to bear the brunt of a heavy engagement. The charge those 4 ships made toward the Japanese formation placed them in a role that went well beyond any reasonable definition of supporting action. They were the attack. They were the shield. They were the mechanism by which the battle was, at its most critical point, prevented from ending in the destruction of the American heavy cruiser. The men who served on those ships on that morning did something that the Navy's tactical manuals would not have sanctioned, and that the mathematics of the situation did not support. They did it because they were ordered to. They did it because the situation demanded it. They did it because the other option was to watch the Salt Lake City die. Across the Japanese formation, the human reality was equally specific, equally individual, and equally worth understanding. The men aboard Nachi and Maya were naval professionals of considerable experience and quality. They had been trained in a naval tradition that placed enormous emphasis on disciplined, effective gunnery. The sustained accuracy that the Japanese cruisers demonstrated throughout the engagement was not the product of superior equipment alone, but of crews who had worked their systems to a high standard. They were also men operating under command in a hierarchical system, executing orders within a tactical and strategic framework that they had not designed and could not fully see. Hosogaya's decision to withdraw affected every man in that formation, not as an abstract tactical choice, but as the specific experience of turning away from a fight, of pointing the bows north and watching the American ships recede. Whether they understood, in those minutes, what that decision would mean for the campaign they were part of, for the garrisons they had been trying to supply, for the men on Attu who were waiting for those convoys, is something the record does not tell us. What the record does tell us, from both sides, is that the men who fought that morning were defined by it in ways that lasted the rest of their lives. Survivors of the engagement, both American and Japanese, who, wrote accounts or gave interviews in the decades after the war, described the 26th of March with a specificity and emotional weight that distinguished it from other events in their service records. There is something about an engagement of that length, that intensity, and that proximity to catastrophe. Something about the specific quality of 3.5 hours of sustained combat against an opponent who should have been able to finish you, that marks the people who go through it differently from other forms of military experience. Not better or worse, simply differently, more specifically, with a precision of memory that ordinary time does not produce. The men who had been in the engine rooms of the Salt Lake City when she stopped were particularly specific in their later accounts, describing the quality of the silence when the engines died, the specific nature of the work they were doing, the awareness of what stopping meant in the context of the battle that was happening around them. These are not the accounts of men describing an abstract experience. They are the accounts of men describing a specific morning in a specific place, when specific to decisions they made had consequences that they could measure in the most direct terms available. They were alive, and the ship was alive because of what they had done. That knowledge, that particular, intimate knowledge, is something that no subsequent account can fully replicate. But it can be acknowledged, and it should be. The battle belonged, in its final meaning, to the men who fought it, not to the admirals who gave the orders, though their decisions mattered enormously, not to the planners in Pearl Harbor who intercepted the Japanese messages and set the interception in motion, not to the historians who would later argue about what it meant and why it happened. It belonged to the specific human beings on those ships, on that morning, in that water. Their names are in the records. Their ships are in the history books. Their actions, the specific, granular, physical actions of men doing difficult work under impossible conditions, are the substance of what the battle actually was. Everything else is commentary. Chapter 14. The press, the censors, and the silence. Why? The world did not know. Within hours of the guns going quiet on the 26th of March, 1943, the machinery of wartime information management began processing what had happened off the Komandorski Islands. It was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable story. An outnumbered American task group had fought a superior Japanese force to a standstill, surviving against odds that no pre-battle calculation would have supported in the most remote naval engagement of the Pacific War, under normal circumstances, or under the circumstances that peacetime journalism would have applied. This was front-page material. It was the kind of story that wars need: endurance, unlikely survival, professional excellence under extreme pressure. It was, in short, the kind of story that the American public in March of 1943 was hungry for. What the American public got instead was very nearly nothing. The battle was acknowledged, briefly, without detail, without the names of ships or the specifics of the engagement. A short notice confirmed that American and Japanese naval forces had clashed in the North Pacific, that American forces had performed creditably, and that the engagement had ended with the Japanese withdrawing. The details that would have made that summary into an actual story: the disparity in force, the hours of sustained gunnery, the stopping of the Salt Lake City, the destroyer charge, the near miraculous engineering recovery. These were withheld. They were withheld deliberately by a censorship apparatus that had developed through the first year of the war into a sophisticated system for managing information in ways that served what the military and the government judged to be the strategic interest. The reasons for the suppression were not, in every case, cynical. Some of the information was withheld for legitimate operational security reasons. The Japanese should not know, for instance, how depleted the Salt Lake City's ammunition supply had been at the battle's end, because that information would tell them how close they had come to a decisive result and might influence their decision-making in future engagements. Some of the information about damage was withheld because the Navy had a consistent policy of not disclosing specifics of battle damage to ships that were still in service, on the grounds that this information was operationally valuable to the enemy. These were reasonable considerations, and the men who made them were not simply trying to manage public perception, but other aspects of the suppression were less clearly driven by security concerns and more clearly driven by institutional image management. The Navy in 1943 was still working through the consequences of some extremely difficult early months. Of Pearl Harbor, of the losses at Savo Island and other early Pacific engagements. And there was sensitivity at senior levels about any story that acknowledged a significant American force had been badly outmatched for an extended period. The Komandorski engagement, told honestly, required acknowledging that McMorris had found himself facing a force that his intelligence had not prepared him for, that his heavy cruiser had been stopped in the water by a combination of battle damage and engineering failure, and that his survival had been as much a function of Hosogaya's decision to withdraw as of anything the Americans had done. That was a complicated story. It was an honest story. But it was not the straightforward triumph narrative that public communications preferred. The result was that the Battle of the Komandorski Islands passed through the public consciousness of March 1943, leaving almost no impression. The newspapers had other things to cover. North Africa was reaching its decisive phase. The submarine war in the Atlantic was at its peak intensity. The enormous industrial and logistical story of American war production was generating a constant flow of material for correspondents and editors. The North Pacific, which had never been a high-profile theatre, produced a brief item in the shipping news, and then returned to its accustomed obscurity. The men who had been in that battle came home, when they eventually came home, to families and communities who had not the faintest idea what their specific service in the Aleutians had looked like. That was, in its way, its own kind of cost, less visible than the dead and wounded, but real for the people who bore it. The post-war unclassification process slowly released the details of the engagement into the historical record. Action reports, damage assessments, operational communications. These became available to researchers over the decades following the war's end, and the scholars and naval historians who worked with them began assembling the full picture of what the 26th of March had actually contained. The gap between the brief wartime press treatment of the battle and the picture that emerged from the primary sources was striking. The wartime record had described an engagement in passive, minimal terms. The primary sources described something far richer. Hours of sustained combat, individual acts of extraordinary competence and courage, a tactical situation that had been balanced on an edge for most of its duration. John Lorelli's book on the battle, published by the Naval Institute Press in 1984, was the most comprehensive single account to emerge from the primary sources. It drew on action reports, survivor accounts, and the available Japanese records to produce a narrative of the engagement that finally gave the 26th of March the serious treatment it deserved. The book did not achieve wide popular readership. It was a work of naval history, aimed at the audience that reads naval history, which is not the same audience that shapes popular memory of a war, but it established the factual foundation that subsequent discussions of the battle have relied on, and it brought the details of the engagement into a form that serious students of the Pacific War could engage with. The broader public silence around Komandorski reflected something beyond wartime censorship. It reflected a structural feature of how wars are remembered. The engagements that become famous are generally those that produced visually spectacular results, enormous casualty figures, or decisive strategic outcomes that could be understood without reference to their complicated context. Midway produced dramatic carrier losses. Guadalcanal produced months of brutal attrition that generated constant news. Iwo Jima produced the photograph. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands produced, in immediate visible terms, nothing sunk, nobody conquered, no territory changed hands. That it had changed the conditions of the Aleutian campaign in ways that would take weeks to manifest was a form of strategic significance that required context to appreciate, and that did not lend itself to the kind of simple, powerful image that shapes popular historical memory. The veterans of the engagement largely accepted their obscurity with the characteristic stoicism of men who had been through something that words were inadequate to describe, and who had returned to a country that was absorbed in the enormous ongoing business of winning a world war. They knew what they had done. The people who needed to know, the Navy, their commanding officers, their fellow sailors, knew it too. Whether the general public knew was, in the hierarchy of concerns that a combat veteran carries, not near the top. The public's ignorance was real, the experience was real, and the experience had a permanence that no amount of public acknowledgement could have enhanced, or public silence could diminish. What happened in those waters happened. It was real. And the men who were there knew exactly how real it was, every day for the rest of their lives. Chapter 15, The Japanese Reckoning. Hosogaya, Tokyo, and the Cost of Caution. The Imperial Japanese Navy's response to the outcome of the 26th of March was swift, institutional, and unforgiving in the way that institutional responses to perceived failures tend to be when the institution is under acute pressure and looking for explanations. The Pacific War had not, by March of 1943, produced the series of decisive Japanese victories that Tokyo's strategic planning had relied upon. Midway had been catastrophic. The Guadalcanal campaign had consumed resources and energy at rates that the pre-war planners had never anticipated. The strategic situation was not yet critical. The final reckoning was still in the future. But the margin for the kind of disappointment that Komandorski represented was narrowing, and Hosogaya had handed Tokyo a disappointment that it needed to account for. The review of Hosogaya's conduct of the battle was conducted in the weeks following the engagement. The specific findings of that review, the precise charges, the arguments made in Hosogaya's defense, the weight given to the various factors he had cited, are not fully reconstructed in the available historical record. What is clear is the outcome. Hosogaya was relieved of his command and did not receive another major operational assignment. The Japanese Navy's institutional verdict was that he had failed to press an advantage that he possessed, that his caution, whatever its justification in his own calculation, had produced an outcome that fell well below what his force should have been capable of achieving. The fairness of that verdict is a question that historians have approached from several directions. In Hosogaya's favor, His fuel concerns were real. His ships were operating at the extreme end of their range, in waters where mechanical reliability could not be taken for granted, and the return voyage from the battle area to the nearest Japanese base was a significant undertaking. Running his ships dry in the North Pacific would have been a catastrophe far worse than any result of the engagement itself. His ammunition concerns were also grounded in real standing orders, orders that reflected institutional lessons learned from earlier engagements where Japanese forces had depleted their magazines and found themselves in subsequent situations without the means to respond. These were not invented justifications. They were real operational constraints that any flag officer in his position would have been weighing against Hosogaya. The opportunity he turned away from was, as the subsequent evidence made clear, closer to decisive than he knew. The Salt Lake City's ammunition supply was nearly exhausted. McMorris's formation was damaged and stretched to the limit of its ability to continue the fight. The American aircraft that Hosogaya feared were not yet in a position to affect the engagement. If he had pressed for another 30 minutes, if he had closed the range and committed his full firepower to the task of finishing the stopped or near-stopped American cruiser, the outcome of the engagement would very likely have been the destruction of the Salt Lake City and potentially other ships. That would have been a significant tactical victory. It would have been, in the context of the Aleutian campaign, a significant strategic blow. It would not have saved the Aleutian campaign for Japan. The larger strategic forces arrayed against the Japanese position in those islands were already too strong, but it would have cost the Americans dearly and would have changed the timeline of what followed. The gap between what Hosogaya knew and what the record subsequently revealed about the American condition is one of the most instructive illustrations in the battle's history of the fog of war as a practical phenomenon. Hosogaya made his decision based on the information he had. The information he had was incomplete in ways that were not his fault. The nature of a naval engagement at range in poor conditions, with both sides actively managing their exposure, means that the true condition of the enemy is always partly inferred and never fully known. He inferred, from the sustained and aggressive American resistance, that the American force retained more fighting capacity than it actually did. He was wrong, but the inference was not unreasonable, given what he could actually see. The deeper question, the one that goes beyond the specific tactical decisions of the 26th of March, is what the Komandorski engagement reveals about the institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy at this stage of the war. By early 1943, the Navy had been through enough difficult engagements to know that the pre-war assumptions about quick, decisive Japanese victories were not holding. The strategic situation required a kind of operational flexibility, a willingness to accept tactical risk in pursuit of strategic necessity that the institutional framework was struggling to provide. Officers who pressed their advantage and succeeded were celebrated. Officers who failed to press and came home short of a decisive result were, as Hosogaya discovered, not treated with understanding. But the culture that required aggressive pressing of advantages regardless of operational constraints was also the culture that had produced the losses at Midway, losses driven partly by overconfidence, partly by insufficient respect for risk. The Japanese Navy in 1943 was caught between two failure modes, and the institutional response to Komandorski did not resolve that tension. It simply punished one expression of it. The broader strategic cost of the Komandorski outcome for Japan was not immediately visible in the engagement's immediate aftermath, but accumulated steadily through the weeks that followed. The decision that Tokyo made in response to the battle to abandon surface convoys to Attu and rely on submarine supply represented the effective severing of the Japanese logistical connection to their Aleutian garrisons. What submarines could carry was inadequate for the needs of the men on Attu. The garrison that the convoy had been trying to supply in March was the garrison that American forces encountered in May, weakened, undersupplied, and fighting the kind of final battle that men fight when they know that no reinforcement is coming and that the only available end is the one that they choose for themselves. The connection between Komandorski in March and Attu in May is not incidental. It is direct. Hosogaya spent the remainder of the war in assignments that kept him away from combat command. The specific record of those assignments is not the kind of information that wartime Japanese records made easily available to subsequent historians. What is clear is that the career of a flag officer who had commanded a significant North Pacific force effectively ceased in its operational aspect with the aftermath of the 26th of March. He survived the war. He lived through the years of the American occupation and the reconstruction of Japan that followed. What he made in those years of the decisions that had defined his last major command, how he assessed them, whether he defended them or questioned them in the privacy of whatever reflective space the post-war years gave him. The record does not tell us. History records the decision and its consequences. The interior life of the man who made it remains his own. The Japanese officers and men who had been aboard Nachi and Maya and the other ships of Hosogaya's force on the 26th of March went on to the subsequent phases of the Pacific War, which were not kind to them or to their ships. The Nachi survived into 1944 before meeting her end in circumstances entirely different from the grey North Pacific morning of the Komandorski engagement. The men who had fired her guns on the 26th of March and had watched the American ships withdraw rather than the other, way around carried that experience into the remaining years of the war, through the progressive reversals that redefined what the Pacific conflict meant from the Japanese side. The battle they had fought in those northern waters became, in the longer perspective, a prologue to a story that ended in ways none of them could have foreseen from the bridge of a cruiser on a cold morning in March of 1943. The reckoning that Tokyo imposed on Hosogaya was, in the end, less about what he had done and more about what the larger situation required. Someone to be blamed for. The Aleutian campaign was failing. The supply lines were breaking. The garrisons were dying on their islands. None of that was solely the result of one decision made by one flag officer on one morning. But institutions under pressure need their explanations, and Hosogaya's decision provided the most visible and most specific point in the record to which the failure of the campaign could be attributed. History has complicated that attribution considerably. But in the immediate institutional context of March 1943, it served the purpose it was assigned. Chapter 16, Legacy and Memory. How the battle was eventually found. There is a kind of historical justice that operates on a very long timeline. It does not correct every omission or restore every forgotten story. But it does, with irregular and unpredictable persistence, work its way back toward events that deserve more than the obscurity they were assigned at the time. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands did not receive its proper historical treatment for decades after the guns went quiet. When that treatment finally came, incrementally through the work of historians and naval professionals and surviving veterans who refused to let the story dissolve entirely. It produced a reassessment that placed the engagement where it belongs, as one of the most singular and instructive naval actions of the Second World War. The rediscovery of Komandorski was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded through the post-war decades, as the classified records of the engagement were gradually opened to researchers, as the generation of men who had been there began to tell their stories in forms that the historical record could preserve, and as the small community of serious naval historians working on the Pacific War encountered an action that, the more they examined it, the more it refused to yield the kind of simple narrative summary that general histories preferred. It was too long for a brief mention and too complicated for a simple verdict. It demanded a sustained engagement from anyone who tried to write about it honestly. The historians who met that demand produced work that, while it never reached the popular audience that Midway or Guadalcanal commanded, established the engagement's significance firmly within the professional literature of the naval war. The Naval Institute Press publication by John Lorelli was, as mentioned in a previous chapter, the landmark scholarly treatment. But before Lorelli, there were accounts in the proceedings of the United States Naval Institute, the professional journal of the American naval community, that brought the engagement's details to the attention of serving officers and historians in the post-war decades. These accounts did what the wartime press treatment had failed to do. They told the story accurately, with the specific details that made the outcome comprehensible, and they placed it in the context of the broader Aleutian campaign in a way that made its strategic significance clear. The audience for those accounts was small by general standards, but it was the right audience. The people whose professional responsibility included understanding what had happened in those waters and why it mattered. Veterans organizations connected to the ships that had fought at Komandorski maintained their own forms of commemoration through the post-war years. The USS Salt Lake City veterans, men who had served on the ship and who carried the 26th of March as one of the defining experiences of their service, held reunions, maintained correspondence, and preserved among themselves the specific memory of what the battle had felt like from the inside. These private commemorations were not widely visible to the public, but they were real and they were sustained. The men who had been on that ship on that morning kept the story alive within their own community. Long after the war had receded into general history, and long after the specific details of one engagement in the North Pacific had ceased to have any claim on national attention, the broader cultural rediscovery of the Aleutian campaign, the growing recognition, particularly from the late 20th century onward, that the war on American soil deserved the same serious historical attention as the campaigns in Europe and the Central Pacific, brought Komandorski along with it as one of the campaign's central events. The National World War II Museum's engagement with the Aleutian story, including the development of exhibition material that brought the campaign's context to a wider audience, was part of this broader cultural recovery. The specific geography of the Aleutians, the remoteness, the weather, the specific misery of operations in those conditions began to be understood by audiences who had never previously had occasion to think about the North Pacific in wartime. Within that growing understanding, the Battle of the 26th of March found a context that made its significance more accessible. The question of what kind of legacy Komandorski carries what it means, in the broadest sense, for the tradition of naval warfare and for the understanding of how the Second World War was won, has more than one answer. At the tactical level, it is a study in the relationship between firepower and will, a demonstration that numerical and material advantage, however substantial, does not automatically translate into tactical victory when the opposing force is willing to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The American task group on the 26th of March was outgunned. That is not a debatable point. What was not predetermined by the balance of forces was how long they would keep fighting, how much damage they would absorb before seeking terms or breaking off, how much their resistance would cost the superior force in time, and ammunition and decision-making pressure. Those things were determined by the men, not the ships, and the men chose to fight. At the strategic level, the legacy is a study in the relationship between tactical outcomes and strategic consequences. A reminder that battles are not self-contained events, but links in chains of cause and effect that extend far beyond the immediate engagement. The Battle of the 26th of March did not, in itself, determine the outcome of the Aleutian campaign, but it shaped the conditions that produced that outcome in ways that are clear and direct. The supply chain was broken. The garrisons were weakened. The Japanese decision-making was disrupted. These consequences were not visible in the battle's immediate tactical record. No ships sunk, no territory seized, no dramatic visible result. They were embedded in the decision that Hosogaya made when he turned north, and they played out through the 6 weeks that followed. At the human level, legacy is simply the record of what specific men did on a specific morning. That record is, by the standards of what human beings are capable of, under extreme pressure, a remarkable one. Engineers who saved their ship. Destroyermen who charged a superior force. Gunners who maintained effective fire for 3.5 hours under sustained return fire. An admiral who chose to fight, rather than run and managed the consequences of that choice, with the skill and steadiness of a man who understood what his mission required. These are not abstractions. They are specific human achievements, performed at the edge of what training and will and professional preparation can produce, in conditions that no one would have designed for the purpose of testing those qualities, but that tested them completely, nevertheless. The legacy of Komandorski is, in the end, the same as the legacy of all forgotten battles. It is the insistence of the truth on being told. The story was suppressed, overlooked, overshadowed, and marginalized for decades. But it did not disappear. The documents survived. The veterans remembered. The historians found the records. And the battle, in the fullness of time, received the kind of reckoning that the men who fought it deserved. That reckoning is still not complete. There are aspects of the engagement, particularly on the Japanese side, where the available records remain sparse, and the full picture remains partially assembled. But enough is known, and has been known for long enough, that the battle's place in the history of the Second World War can no longer be honestly described as forgotten. It is simply and only not yet famous enough. Chapter 17. The Last Daylight Gun Battle. What Komandorski Means for Naval History. There is something fitting, in retrospect, about the fact that the last pure surface gunnery duel of the Second World War, the last battle fought entirely between warships, in daylight, without aircraft on either side, happened in the most remote and overlooked corner of the Pacific Theater. It happened without an audience. It happened without the kind of media coverage that marks events as significant in the moment they occur. It happened in cold grey water, between tired ships and exhausted men, in a theater that neither Washington nor Tokyo had identified as a place where history was being made, and yet it was exactly that place. The 26th of March 1943 closed a chapter in the history of naval warfare that had been opening since the first ironclad fired its guns at another ironclad in the age before the Great Wars. That chapter ended without ceremony in the North Pacific as the Japanese ships turned north and the American ships stopped firing. The significance of Komandorski as the last of its kind did not require that it was recognized as such at the time. The men fighting the battle were not thinking about its place in naval history. They were thinking about the next salvo, the next maneuver, the next damage control problem. The historical significance was something that subsequent analysis imposed on the event, looking back from a vantage point where the trajectory of naval warfare was clear. From that vantage point, the battle appears as both an endpoint and a portal, the final expression of a tradition of surface gunnery that had defined naval combat for nearly a century, and the threshold beyond which that tradition gave way to the new forms of naval power that carrier aviation and guided weapons would bring. The transition had already been underway for years before the 26th of March. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 had demonstrated conclusively that the aircraft carrier had displaced the battleship as the primary instrument of naval power, that the ability to project striking force at ranges measured in hundreds of miles was more decisive than any combination of heavy guns that surface ships could carry. The older form of naval combat, the gunnery duel, the geometry of range and bearing and fall of shot, had not been made obsolete overnight. Surface ships still fought each other with guns throughout the Pacific War, most notably in the darkness of the Guadalcanal naval battles, which produced some of the most intense and confused surface engagements in naval history. But those night battles were fought in confined waters, at short range, without the extended long-range precision gunnery that characterized Komandorski. They were a different kind of fighting. Komandorski was the last time that two opposing surface forces met in open water, in daylight, at range, and fought exclusively with their guns. It was the last time that the full technical and human apparatus of long-range naval gunnery, the fire control systems, the spotters, the fall of shot corrections, the accumulated expertise of crews who had been trained specifically for this kind of engagement, was the primary determinant of the battle's outcome. After the 26th of March, 1943, that kind of battle never happened again. Not because the ships changed, though they did. Not because the guns became obsolete, though they eventually would. But because the context that made such a battle possible, the open water encounter between roughly matched surface forces, without air power, without submarines, in conditions that allowed sustained long-range gunnery, was so specific and so dependent on a particular conjunction of geography, technology, and circumstance that it could not be replicated. The naval historians who have written about Komandorski have generally treated its status as the last daylight gunnery duel as one of the engagement's primary claims to historical significance. That status is real and it matters, but it can also, if overemphasized, distort the engagement's meaning by making it primarily about what it ended, rather than about what it was. The battle off the Komandorski Islands was not significant, because it was the last of something. It was significant because of what the men who fought it did, and because of what those actions meant for the campaign of which the battle was a part. Its status as the end of a naval tradition adds a layer of historical resonance. It does not substitute for the specific, detailed, human story of the 26th of March. The broader lessons that naval professionals have drawn from the Komandorski engagement over the decades since the records became available are multiple and sometimes contradictory, as lessons from complex engagements tend to be. On the American side, the battle demonstrated the value of sustained aggressive fighting by outnumbered forces. The willingness to absorb punishment and keep inflicting damage rather than breaking off at the point when the tactical situation suggests that breaking off is the rational response. It demonstrated the critical importance of damage control capability and engineering proficiency in a sustained engagement, the extent to which the outcome of a battle can depend not on the gunnery, but on the work done deep in the ship by men who never fire a gun. And it demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, that intelligence estimates of enemy strength are starting points rather than certainties, and that the plan made on the basis of those estimates must be flexible enough to survive contact with a reality that differs from them. On the Japanese side, the lessons that subsequent analysis has drawn are primarily centered on Hosogaya's decision to withdraw, and on the broader institutional dynamics that shaped the environment in which that decision was made. The Imperial Japanese Navy's handling of the Komandorski aftermath, with its swift assignment of blame and relief of command, did not produce better decision-making in subsequent engagements. The pressure it created, the pressure toward aggressive pressing of advantages, regardless of operational constraints, was part of the same complex of institutional forces that produced other, more catastrophic Japanese naval failures as the war progressed. The lesson from Komandorski that Tokyo chose to learn was not the most useful one available. The technological lesson that the engagement offers is perhaps the most clearly articulated of all the things it demonstrates. Long-range gunnery in 1943 was a precise but probabilistic art, one in which the investment of enormous resources in ships, training, equipment, and crew development produced a capability that was still fundamentally dependent on chance in each individual engagement. The near misses that surrounded the Salt Lake City throughout the morning, the hundreds of large caliber shells that fell within a small number of yards of her hull without hitting her, represent a measure of the inherent randomness in an activity that both sides were conducting at high levels of proficiency. The gap between a hit and a near miss at the ranges involved was sometimes a matter of feet. The difference between those two outcomes was, for the ship on the receiving end, enormous. Technology could narrow that gap, but could not eliminate it. The men who worked within that gap, who operated their systems as well as they could be, operated and then lived with whatever the physics of the falling shells produced, were in the business of managed probability, not certainty. For the men who fought that morning, historical significance was not the currency in which they valued their experience. They valued it the way soldiers and sailors have always valued it, in the specific terms of who was there, what happened, and who came home. The battle was the last of its kind. It was strategically decisive in ways that took weeks to become visible. It demonstrated professional qualities that naval historians have spent decades analyzing. All of that is true, and underneath all of it, prior to all of it, is simply the fact that men went to sea on a cold March morning, found something worse than they expected, and refused to let it finish them. That is what Komandorski is, at its core. The rest is the frame around that picture. Chapter 18, The Reckoning, what the Battle of Komandorski Islands tells us. Now, we began this story with an ocean, grey, cold, indifferent, vast. We began with the image of a stretch of water so remote that it barely registers on most maps, where something happened in the winter of 1943 that the world did not notice and has only partially recovered. We have spent the better part of 4 hours moving through the layers of that story. The geography and the strategy, the ships and the men, the intelligence and the planning, the battle itself, and the long, slow process by which its significance became clear. Now, at the end of it, the question that every serious piece of historical work has to face is the one that makes all the research and all the narrative worth undertaking. What does it mean now? Not in 1943. Now. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands means different things at different levels of analysis, and the honesty of any account of it requires holding all of those levels fulls simultaneously rather than reducing it to a single lesson. At the most immediate level, it is a story about performance under pressure, about what well-trained, experienced professional sailors can do when the situation exceeds every parameter they trained for. The answer, in this case, is more than the situation has any right to expect. McMorris's task group outperformed every reasonable prediction, not because of luck, though luck was a factor, as it is a factor in every engagement, not because of superior equipment, which they did not have, but because of the accumulated weight of professional preparation, institutional culture, and individual character that produces the kind of performance that the 26th of March required. That answer is not time-limited. It applies to the question of what human beings are capable of in extremis as clearly today as it did in 1943. At the strategic level, the battle is a study in the relationship between the tactical and the strategic that every serious student of warfare needs to understand. The engagement produced no visible decisive result in its immediate aftermath. No ships sunk, no territory taken, no dramatic, legible outcome. And yet it changed the conditions of the campaign it was part of in ways that compounded through the weeks, that followed into consequences that were both clear and significant. The Japanese supply line was broken. The garrison on Attu was weakened. The American assault on Attu, when it came in May of 1943, was conducted against a force that had been denied the supplies it needed because of what had happened in March. The battle was the cause. Attu was the effect. That causal chain is not always visible in the general historical accounts, but it is there, and following it illuminates something important about how campaigns actually work. At the human level, which is, in the end, the level that matters most, the battle is a record of specific men doing specific things in specific circumstances that were as demanding as the Second World War produced anywhere. The engineers who saved the Salt Lake City, the destroyermen who made the charge, the gun crews who maintained effective fire for 3.5 hours under return fire from a superior force, the officers who made the decisions that kept their ships alive and their formation fighting when the rational response to the situation was to break off and run. These are not archetypes. They are people. They had names and histories and lives that extended on both sides of the 26th of March, 1943. The battle was a day in those lives, the most extreme day, perhaps, but still a day embedded in a human existence that was more than any single engagement. The historical record tends to reduce them to their function in the narrative. They deserve better than that, and the best way to give them better is to remember that they were people before they were historical figures. The forgotten battles of any war contain, in their forgottenness, a specific kind of truth. They tell us something about how wars are remembered, about the forces that shape public memory and determine which events become famous and which subside into the specialist literature. The forces that kept Komandorski obscure were not mysterious. Wartime censorship, the competition of more visually dramatic events, the North Pacific's structural marginalization in the public imagination of the Pacific War, and the battle's lack of a simple, powerful visual image that could carry its story into popular culture. These forces were real. They are still operating in different forms on the record of every conflict being fought or recently concluded. Understanding them, understanding why certain battles and certain sacrifices become famous while others do not, is part of the larger work of historical honesty. The Aleutian campaign as a whole has received increasing historical attention in the years since the turn of the century, partly because of the campaign's geographic distinctiveness. It happened on American soil, which gives it a claim on American historical memory that no other Pacific campaign shares, and partly because the 50th and 75th anniversary commemorations produced renewed scholarly and institutional engagement with the campaign's record. The National World War II Museum's work on the Aleutian campaign brought materials and context to audiences who had no previous engagement with the story. These are the mechanisms by which the forgotten become, in time, the remembered. They are slow. They are imperfect. They do not fully compensate for the decades of obscurity, but they move in the right direction. What does the Battle of the Komandorski Islands tell us now, specifically? In a moment when the Pacific Ocean has once again become a focus of strategic attention, when the relationship between naval power and political will in the North Pacific is a live question, rather than a historical one, when the lessons of how outnumbered forces perform against superior adversaries are as operationally relevant as they have ever been. It tells us, first and most simply, that the numbers do not determine the outcome. They shape the probabilities. They define the operating envelope, but within that envelope, the decisions made by specific men in specific moments against specific pressures have a weight that no pre-battle calculation can fully account for. The Salt Lake City should not have survived the 26th of March. She did. Understanding why she did, really understanding it, at the level of the specific men and the specific decisions, is the work that the battle's history demands of us. It tells us, second, that the strategic significance of an action is not always legible in its immediate tactical outcome. The history of the Second World War is full of this principle, but Komandorski illustrates it with particular clarity. The engagement looked, in the hours after the guns went quiet, like an ambiguous non-result. Nobody sunk, nothing decisive, a superior force gone home without finishing the job they came to do. 6 weeks later, the consequences of that non-result were written in the condition of the Japanese garrison on Attu, and in the outcome of the American assault that followed. Strategic significance is often retrospective. The willingness to fight and the ability to endure can produce consequences that are invisible in the moment and unmistakable in the aftermath. That principle was true in March of 1943. It remains true. And it tells us finally that the obligation to remember, to do the work of finding the forgotten battles and the overlooked sacrifices and bringing them back into the record with the honesty and detail they deserve, is not a sentimental indulgence. It is a practical necessity. The lessons that Komandorski carries are not abstract. They are specific, about damage control, about commander decision-making, about the relationship between tactical outcomes and strategic consequences, about what happens when intelligence estimates collide with operational reality. These lessons were paid for at a cost measured in the specific lives and specific damage of the 26th of March 1943. Using them, really using them, as living knowledge rather than historical curiosity, requires keeping the story alive and keeping it honest. That is what this documentary has tried to do. The grey water south of the Komandorski Islands looks the same today as it looked on the morning of the 26th of March, 1943. Cold, deep, indifferent to the things that human beings have done in it and around it. The ships are gone, scrapped, sunk in subsequent engagements, transformed into the rust and silt of a war that ended 8 decades ago. The men are gone, or nearly so. The last of the generation that fought that morning have moved beyond the reach of any interviewer or oral historian. What remains is the record and the story assembled from it, and the obligation to give that story to anyone who is willing to sit with the cold grey water long enough to understand what happened there. This has been that story. Now you know what the world forgot.